What if Earth once knew something, and forgot, long before the first shells hardened in the Cambrian seas, before eyes opened to sunlight, before bones etched their quiet signatures into the stone? The planet was already ancient. Wherever this moment finds life tonight, beneath a dim ceiling beside the soft breath of night air beyond a window, or under a sky where distant stars drift like slow embers, this story begins not with movement, but with stillness, because the earliest Earth did not rush. Time did not hurry forward in the way human clocks insist it must. Instead, it settled, layer by layer, ocean by ocean, silence pressing gently upon silence until entire continents slept beneath the weight of forgotten ages. And somewhere inside that vast quiet, life had already begun, not loudly, not dramatically, but as a whisper in water. The rocks remember almost none of it, the silent world before memory. 4 billion years ago, the Earth was already learning how to breathe. The sky was different then, not blue in the way modern skies glow above quiet forests and cities. Instead, it hung heavy with volcanic breath, methane, carbon dioxide, drifting veils of gases that blurred the sunlight into something dimmer, older. The oceans, too, were strange. They did not sparkle beneath gentle waves as they do now. They carried iron in their waters, dissolved like quiet dust. Entire seas shimmered faintly red beneath a sun that seemed slightly dimmer in the young universe. And yet, within those restless waters, something delicate had begun. Cells, tiny vessels of chemistry drifting slowly through the ancient sea. No bones, no shells, and no shapes that stone could easily remember. Just living chemistry, soft membranes holding fragile reactions that borrowed energy from sunlight, or from the slow breath of volcanic minerals rising from the seafloor. These earliest organisms were quiet architects. They altered the planet without intention, without awareness, without leaving fossils that the future would easily find. For hundreds of millions of years they floated, multiplied, dissolved, and returned to the sea again. Their entire existence written only in shifting chemistry. Time moved differently then, not in centuries, not even in millennia, but in the slow rhythm of continents forming and dissolving beneath the restless movement of Earth's crust. The planet was young, but already patient, already learning how to forget, because forgetting is part of geology. The surface of Earth does not preserve its memories like pages inside a book. It behaves more like sand beneath an endless tide. Layers rise, layers sink, stone melts, mountains crumble into dust and return to the ocean floor where they sleep again beneath miles of sediment. And so the earliest chapters of life were written into rocks that no longer exist, subducted, melted, folded back into the mantle where heat slowly erased their delicate structures. The planet, in its quiet way, recycles its own past. And yet something remains. Even when fossils vanish, chemistry sometimes lingers. Inside certain ancient rocks, rare fragments that survive the planet's endless reshaping, tiny isotopic signatures whisper of biological activity. Carbon that once passed through living cells. Sulfur that moved through microbial metabolisms older than complex life. These traces are faint, but they are real. They tell a simple truth. Life had already settled into the oceans long before the Cambrian Explosion ever arrived. And it remained there for a very long time. Nearly 3 billion years passed in this microbial world. 3 billion years of oceans filled with drifting, invisible ecosystems. Entire evolutionary stories unfolding within microscopic realms too fragile for stone to preserve. It is difficult to imagine such spans of time. Human history barely fills a blink compared to them. Even the age of dinosaurs, a period that feels ancient beyond comprehension, occupies only a thin slice near the surface of Earth's deep memory. Below that thin slice lies an ocean of forgotten time, and inside that ocean, where life evolved slowly, patiently experimenting with new chemistries, new metabolisms, new ways of capturing energy from a restless planet. One of those experiments changed the sky itself. Certain microbes, cyanobacteria, began releasing oxygen as a byproduct of photosynthesis. At first, the oxygen vanished into the oceans, reacting with dissolved iron and other minerals. The seas rusted quietly. Iron settled into the sediments as red bands that geologists would one day call banded iron formations, striped pages of stone recording the slow transformation of Earth's atmosphere. Only after millions of years did oxygen begin leaking into the air above the planet. The sky was changing, the chemistry of the oceans was changing, life itself was changing, and yet the fossil record remained almost silent. Soft bodies dissolved. Delicate ecosystems vanished without leaving bones or shells behind. Stone waited patiently for harder structures to appear. Until then, it remembered almost nothing. But silence does not always mean emptiness. Sometimes it means the story was written in a language the rocks have forgotten how to read. Because during those immense spans of time, evolution did not stop. It wandered, slowly, like continents drifting through a sleeping ocean. Somewhere inside that wandering complexity was stirring. Cells began merging with one another. Ancient symbioses formed, tiny partnerships that would eventually create the complex cells known today as eukaryotes. Within those cells lay new possibilities, new architectures of life, structures capable of building bodies far more intricate than the drifting microbes of the ancient seas. Yet the stage for complexity was quietly assembling. But the planet still waited, the rock still slept, and the fossil record remained almost entirely blank, as if the Earth itself were holding its breath before remembering how to write the next chapter. And what the planet buried in those silent ages, it never fully explained. Some memories sink deeper than stone. Time does not pass in the ancient oceans, it settles, like dust drifting through deep water where sunlight never fully arrives. The young Earth turned slowly beneath a dimmer sun, its continents still uncertain shapes rising and dissolving through the quiet mechanics of plate tectonics. Land was scarce then. Much of the planet's surface lay beneath wide, mineral-rich seas that stretched beyond any horizon life would later know. The world felt unfinished, not empty, but waiting. Within those waters, life continued its patient work. Microbial cities spread across the shallow seafloor, forming strange living structures known today as stromatolites, layered mounds built by countless generations of microorganisms trapping sediment grain by grain. Stone built by breath, each layer a quiet mourning of the sunlight captured by tiny cells, each curve a slow memory of tides passing over shallow seas. These structures rose gently toward the surface of the water, like soft monuments to persistence rather than ambition. No movement, no bones, no eyes, only chemistry repeating itself. For nearly 3 billion years, this was the rhythm of life on Earth, a planetary meditation. The atmosphere gradually changed as oxygen continued its long ascent into the sky. At first, it was a poison to many ancient microbes, that reshaping ecosystems in slow, invisible revolutions. Entire biological worlds faded quietly while new ones adapted to the altered air. Extinction arrived softly in those ages, not through fire or impact or sudden catastrophe, but through chemistry, a molecule appearing in the wrong abundance, a slow shift in the breath of the oceans. The rocks remember these transitions through subtle scars, strange shifts in sulfur isotopes, carbon signatures that wobble gently across the sedimentary layers like faint heartbeats. Each fluctuation hints at ecosystems transforming beyond sight, yet the fossils remain absent. Stone, for all its patience, requires a certain stubbornness from life before it agrees to remember it. Hard parts, minerals, structures capable of resisting the long-dissolving power of water and pressure. Until such bodies emerged, the archive of geology remained mostly blank. But blank pages do not mean empty chapters. Evolution was experimenting. Within certain ancient cells, a remarkable event occurred, one cell entering another and refusing to leave. A partnership formed. The guest became the mitochondrion, a tiny engine that would allow cells to produce far more energy than before. This quiet merger happened more than 1 billion years ago, and it changed the trajectory of life forever. Energy multiplied, possibilities widened. The complex cells known as eukaryotes began to appear, cells with internal structures, flexible membranes, and the capacity to build larger, more intricate forms. Still soft, still fragile, still mostly invisible to stone, but no longer simple, in the deep waters of the Proterozoic Earth. And these new cells drifted slowly through ecosystems dominated by microbes. Some gathered into colonies, others formed filaments. A few began experimenting with multicellularity, cells cooperating, dividing tasks, shaping primitive bodies that existed briefly before dissolving again into the sea. Life was learning, slowly, quietly, without witnesses. and the planet watched in silence. Continents continued their wandering. Supercontinents assembled and fractured again in cycles lasting hundreds of millions of years. Vast mountain ranges rose and eroded into dust, their sediments carried by ancient rivers into shallow seas where they layered themselves into stone. Most of those stones would not survive. Oceanic crust slid back into the mantle like pages pulled from a book and burned. The earth erased its own handwriting. But what remained were fragments, rare sediments preserved within stable continental cores. From those fragments, scientists glimpsed brief silhouettes of ancient organisms, impressions of soft bays pressed gently into mud, faint outlines of strange shapes that do not quite resemble any modern animal. The Ediacaran biota, they are sometimes called, creatures older than the Cambrian world. But even they appear suddenly, and disappear just as quietly. Before them lies an even deeper silence, nearly 2 billion years where complex cells existed but left almost no trace. 1 billion years is difficult to imagine. It is longer than the entire history of animals, longer than forests, dinosaurs, mammals, and human civilizations combined. And during that immense stretch of time, evolution did not sleep. Instead, it continued its quiet wanderings through possibility. Perhaps most experiments remained microscopic. Perhaps complexity was rare, fragile, easily erased by the changing chemistry of the oceans. Or perhaps entire ecosystems rose and fell without leaving bones for the future to read. Because stone is selective, it remembers teeth, it remembers shells. But soft intelligence, drifting bodies, delicate structures built from protein and membrane, those dissolve. The sea keeps their secrets, and so the long prelude before the Cambrian remains one of Earth's quietest eras. 1 billion years of whispers beneath dark water, an age where life was already old, but the rock still had not learned how to listen. Somewhere in those drifting ages, the foundations of modern life were assembling themselves piece by piece: metabolism, cooperation, cellular complexity, all the ingredients, all the patience, waiting for the moment when evolution would discover something new, something stubborn enough to survive burial, something hard enough for stone to remember. Because once life learned how to write itself into rock, the silence of the planet would finally break. But what came before that moment remains folded beneath layers of geological forgetting, and the oceans that carried those early experiments learned long ago how to keep their stories, by letting them disappear. The oldest stories of Earth are not written in words, they are pressed into stone the way wind presses ripples into sand. Subtle, uneven, often incomplete, and the deeper the stone lies beneath the surface of time, the quieter its memory becomes. Far below the layers that hold dinosaurs and forests and coral reefs, there exists a depth where the planet begins to forget its own voice. Rocks grow older there, older than mountains, older than continents as they exist today. Many have been bent by unimaginable pressure. Some have melted and cooled again. Others have been dragged downward into the mantle, their ancient surfaces folded and erased in the slow furnace beneath the crust. The earliest world did not preserve itself. It renewed itself, over and over again. The ocean floors of those distant ages were young and restless, forming along volcanic ridges and then drifting slowly towards subduction zones where they vanished beneath neighbouring plates. A slow conveyor of forgetting every 200 million years or so, and an entire seafloor could disappear into the Earth's interior, taking with it whatever sediments had settled there. If life once flourished across those vanished plains of oceanic crust, its traces would have gone with them, drawn downward into heat and pressure, where even the memory of structure dissolves. Only fragments escaped, small islands of ancient crust known today as cratons. These pieces of continental heartstone remained stable while the rest of the surface churned and recycled around them. Within their deep foundations lie the oldest rocks still accessible to the modern world, minerals that formed more than 3 billion years ago. Tiny crystals of zircon, grains of quartz locked within ancient sediments, and occasionally faint chemical signatures that whisper of life, carbon isotopes, altered in ways that suggest biological processes once moved through those ancient waters. Sulfur compounds shaped by metabolisms older than animals, older than plants, older even than oxygen itself. These signals are not fossils. They do not reveal bodies or shapes, but they reveal activity, something living, something breathing slowly within the early oceans of Earth, the planet's earliest biosphere. And yet, despite billions of years of life, complexity remained hidden for an extraordinarily long time. The microbial world dominated, cells dividing quietly in sunlit shallows, mats of bacteria spreading across warm tidal flats, biofilms clinging to rocks near hydrothermal vents where mineral-rich water rose from deep fractures in the crust. Entire ecosystems unfolded within microscopic realms, their cities of life invisible to the naked eye. For those organisms, the planet itself was vast beyond imagination. A single droplet of seawater could contain an entire universe of biological interaction, predation, cooperation, competition, adaptation. Evolution thrived there. But stone did not record it well. The bodies were too small, too soft, too fleeting. And so the rocks of that age feel strangely silent, even though the oceans themselves were alive with movement at scales too delicate for preservation. Occasionally the silence breaks. Rare impressions appear in ancient sediments, simple shapes pressed into mud long ago, then buried and hardened into stone. Soft-bodied organisms from the late Proterozoic period, creatures with strange forms, leaf-like, disc-shaped, and sometimes resembling quilted fabrics pressed gently into the seafloor. They did not have skeletons, they did not leave bones, yet they represent some of the earliest visible experiments with multicellular life. The Ediacaran organisms, mysterious inhabitants of a world just before the Cambrian. Some appear almost plant-like, though they lived in oceans. Others look like animals that do not belong to any modern lineage. Entire branches of evolution that flickered briefly across the planet and then vanished without descendants. Even these early forms feel incomplete. They arrive suddenly in the fossil record, then disappear before the Cambrian seas fill with trilobites, worms, and shelled creatures that would finally leave abundant fossils behind. Before them, silence. After them, abundance. The transition feels abrupt, and almost like a curtain lifting, but deep time rarely moves in sudden gestures. More often it drifts, slowly gathering momentum until change becomes visible all at once. Perhaps complexity had been building quietly beneath the surface for millions of years before the Cambrian explosion. Perhaps the conditions of the oceans, oxygen levels, nutrient cycles, ecological interactions, simply reached a threshold where new forms of life could suddenly flourish. Or perhaps something else happened, something softer, something that left almost no trace. Because the absence of fossils does not guarantee the absence of complexity. Stone remembers what it can, but most living bodies are not made for stone. They are made for water, for softness, for motion that leaves no imprint once the tide returns. And so the vast ages before the Cambrian remain filled with possibility. 1 billion years of evolutionary wandering, 1 billion years where life experimented quietly within fragile bodies that dissolved back into the sea. Entire ecosystems may have risen and fallen without ever touching the permanence of mineralized bone. Entire stories may have unfolded in forms the rocks could not keep. The planet does not record everything. It only records what survives burial, what resists time, what hardens. And so beneath the Cambrian layers, beneath the fossils that fill museum halls and textbooks, there lies an older world, a softer one, a world where life was already ancient, but the Earth had not yet learned how to remember it clearly, and in that quiet forgetting, many possibilities still drift, like sediment falling through dark water, slow, unseen, unfinished. There is a depth of time where the planet feels almost dreamlike, not empty, but distant. A place where mountains had not yet learned the shapes they carry now, and the continents wandered like slow thoughts drifting across the surface of a restless mind. The Earth, during those long ages before the Cambrian, lived inside cycles far larger than anything familiar today. Supercontinents gathered themselves together, then slowly loosened, then broke apart again. The first of these ancient landmasses, Valbara, Kenorland, Columbia, Rodinia, rose from the shifting plates like temporary gatherings of stone. For hundreds of millions of years they existed as quiet giants beneath the sky, before drifting apart again into scattered fragments. And each cycle reshaped the oceans, each fracture carved new coastlines and flooded new shallow seas. And shallow seas were where life preferred to linger. Sunlight reached there, minerals washed down from young mountains, energy moved through the water in slow, generous currents. Across those ancient shorelines, microbial mats stretched outward like living carpets, thick layers of bacteria and algae woven together through cooperation older than animals themselves. They trapped sediment, held it, stacked it, building their strange mineral towers, stromatolites, layer by patient layer. To the eye of the modern world they appear simple, rounded mounds of limestone, but each one is a fossilized conversation between life and geology. Each thin layer marks a day when sunlight touched the sea. And each grain of sediment caught between microbial filaments tells of waves washing gently across a shoreline that no longer exists. The Earth still carries these quiet monuments. Some stromatolites alive today resemble those that grew more than 3 billion years ago, standing in shallow lagoons like ancient architects who never abandoned their craft. But during the long Proterozoic eon, stromatolites were everywhere. Entire coastlines breathed through them. Vast microbial landscapes stretched across tidal flats where life moved slowly, invisibly, shaping the chemistry of the oceans with quiet persistence. No bones, no shells, just living stone. Yet even in this seemingly simple world, change was unfolding beneath the surface. The oxygen in the atmosphere, once almost absent, continued its slow rise. At first, the gas reacted quickly with exposed minerals, rusting iron, and altering the chemistry of rocks across the surface of the planet. But gradually those mineral sinks filled. The oxygen had nowhere left to hide, and so it began to accumulate in the air. The sky was changing again. What had once been a toxic molecule to many early microbes slowly became the breath of a new biological era. Some organisms learned to harness it for energy. Oxygen metabolism unlocked far greater power within cells, allowing more complex structures to emerge. Larger bodies, more elaborate internal systems, cells that could cooperate with one another to form tissues. Yet for an immense span of time, the world remained largely microscopic. Complex cells existed, multicellular experiments appeared and vanished. But the planet's ecosystems still belonged mostly to the invisible majority. The small, the soft, the dissolving. The fossil record of this age is like a sky covered in fog. Occasionally a faint silhouette appears, a soft-bodied organism preserved in fine sediment, a ripple of strange biological shapes imprinted into ancient mud. But most of the sky remains hidden. There are stretches of nearly 1 billion years where the rocks offer only fragments, tiny hints, whispers. During this vast interval, sometimes called the boring billion, the planet seems almost still. Continents moved slowly. Climate remained relatively stable. The oceans drifted through long periods of quiet equilibrium. Yet beneath that apparent calm, evolution was not idle. It was experimenting. Cells learned to communicate, to share nutrients, and to coordinate their behavior across clusters of living tissue. These early multicellular organisms may have resembled delicate filaments or soft sheets drifting gently across the seafloor. Some may have grown tall like underwater fronds swaying in ancient currents. Others might have crept slowly across sediments, feeding on microbial films in ways that left almost no trace behind. Soft bodies vanish quickly. Water dissolves structure. Sediment compresses fragile tissues into nothing more than faint shadows. Unless conditions are perfect, rapid burial, fine mud, low oxygen, such organisms disappear without leaving evidence, and perfect conditions are rare, which means entire evolutionary pathways may have risen and fallen without ever touching the permanence of stone. The Earth does not record most of what happens upon its surface. It records only what resists disappearance, only what survives pressure, only what mineralizes. And so the Proterozoic world remains partly hidden, like a dream remembered only in fragments upon waking. 1 billion years of quiet life. 1 billion years where complexity slowly assembled its pieces beneath oceans that did not yet host the dramatic forms of later ages. No predators with teeth, no armored shells, no skeletons clattering across the seafloor. Just soft life, waiting, growing, experimenting in silence. And somewhere within that silence, the first sparks of something larger were forming. Ecological interactions, metabolic networks, evolutionary pressures that would eventually ignite a transformation unlike anything the planet had seen before. But that ignition had not yet come. The Earth still drifted through its long meditation of microbial worlds. The ocean still carried life mostly in forms too delicate for geology to hold, and the rocks, patient and ancient, continued to sleep above stories they could barely remember. Somewhere ahead in time, the silence would break. But for now, the planet remained a quiet garden of invisible architects, And the deeper memories of those early oceans continued to settle, layer by layer, like dust falling through the slow breath of time. There are moments in Earth's history when the planet seems to inhale, not quickly, not suddenly, but slowly, over millions of years. During the later stretches of the Proterozoic world, the oceans began to change in ways that were almost imperceptible at first. The chemistry of the seas, yet once dominated by iron-rich waters and microbial breath, started shifting towards something unfamiliar. Oxygen, which had once lingered only in shallow waters and the thin skin of the atmosphere, began slipping deeper into the oceans. It spread quietly, like dawn seeping across a dark horizon. For billions of years, most ocean depths had been starved of oxygen. Microbial life thrived there using other chemical pathways: sulfur, methane, iron. These ancient metabolisms shaped ecosystems in ways that feel almost alien when imagined now. But oxygen carried a different kind of power, a different rhythm of energy. Where oxygen moved, life could grow larger. Cells could build more complicated machinery within themselves. Proteins could fold into elaborate structures. Membranes could support more activity, more communication, and more coordination between neighbouring cells. Energy is the quiet currency of evolution, and oxygen offered abundance. But abundance is rarely simple. As oxygen seeped deeper into the seas, ancient microbial worlds shifted again. Entire communities that had flourished for eons found themselves displaced by organisms that could harness the new chemistry. Extinction arrived once more, slowly, invisible, written not in bones but in changing isotopes within layers of sediment. The rocks hold those shifts like faint breaths across deep time, carbon curves rising and falling, sulfur signatures changing their subtle patterns. These fluctuations hint at ecological revolutions unfolding beneath waters that left almost no visible fossils behind. It was as though the planet itself was rearranging the pieces of life's long puzzle. They're preparing something, waiting for a threshold to be crossed. Meanwhile, the continents continued their quiet wandering. The supercontinent Rodinia, which had gathered itself across the planet like a vast sleeping body of stone, began to fracture. Rifts opened across its surface. Massive valleys sank into the crust as tectonic forces pulled land masses apart. Where continents break, oceans are born. New coastlines appeared, new shallow seas flooded the edges of drifting continents, and shallow seas are fertile places. Sunlight touches their floors. Nutrients wash into them from newly rising mountains. Chemical gradients flow through the water like invisible currents of possibility. Life gathers there. Across these expanding continental shelves, multicellular organisms began to appear more frequently. Not animals yet, at least not in the forms that would later dominate the fossil record, but something approaching that complexity. Soft bodies, flexible shapes, communities of cells cooperating in ways that had never existed before. The Ediacaran world was awakening. Along ancient seafloors, delicate organisms spread across the sediment like quiet gardens. Some resembled fronds rising gently into the water column. Others lay flat against the mud, their quilted surfaces patterned with repeating segments. Still others appeared like discs or spirals pressed softly into the seafloor. Strange bodies. Bodies that do not fit neatly into modern categories. Some scientists believe these organisms represent early animals. Others suspect they belong to entirely different branches of life that later vanished without descendants. Their anatomy is difficult to interpret. They possess no bones, no shells, no teeth, just soft tissue arranged in unfamiliar symmetries, and yet they grew large, sometimes nearly a metre long, quiet presences resting on ancient seabeds where currents drifted gently across their forms. For the first time in billions of years, life had begun to occupy visible space upon the planet. The world was no longer purely microscopic. The oceans now carried creatures large enough to cast faint shadows across the sediment below them. But even this blossoming of soft life remained fragile. Many of these organisms likely fed by absorbing nutrients directly through their surfaces, drawing energy from microbial mats that covered the seafloor like living carpets. Predation, if it existed at all, was rare. Movement was slow. The ecosystem felt almost peaceful compared to the violent ecological interactions that would later define the Cambrian seas. It was a quiet experiment in complexity, a soft rehearsal, bodies learning how to exist together in ways that required coordination across many cells. Yet something was still missing. hardness, structure, durability, tiete. The bodies of these organisms dissolved easily once death arrived. Without mineralized skeletons or shells, their remains rarely survived long enough to fossilize unless conditions were unusually perfect. Even the fossils that do exist are faint impressions, ghostly outlines preserved only because fine sediments settled gently over their resting forms. These delicate fossils appear suddenly in the geological record and then fade again just before the Cambrian explosion. Their disappearance remains mysterious. Perhaps new ecological pressures emerged, perhaps early predators evolved, perhaps environmental conditions shifted once more, or perhaps these organisms simply gave way to new evolutionary strategies that would soon transform the oceans forever. Because the next chapter in Earth's history would not be quiet. The Cambrian seas were approaching, and with them came eyes, teeth, shells, movement, competition, an explosion of forms that the rocks could finally remember clearly. But beneath that coming storm of biological innovation, the earlier world still lingered. 1 billion years of softness, 1 billion years of life experimenting in fragile bodies that dissolved back into the sea. And what those long ages truly contained may never be fully known. Because the oceans are patient historians, they keep their oldest stories by letting them fade, like footprints erased by the tide. Oceans that learn to forget, water does not keep monuments, it keeps motion. Across the long memory of Earth, oceans have swallowed mountains, continents, and entire biological worlds without leaving a scar upon their surface. Waves move endlessly above histories that dissolved long ago, their stories scattered into salt and drifting minerals. The sea does not remember, it reclaims. And during the immense ages before the Cambrian dawn, the oceans were the greatest keepers of silence the planet had ever known. For more than 1 billion years after complex cells first appeared, Earth remained a world where most life lived quietly beneath water that carried no bones, no shells, no structures strong enough to resist decay. Bodies softened, membranes folded, cells divided and dissolved again into the slow chemistry of the sea. When death arrived, the water accepted it gently. Soft tissues collapsed. Microbes returned nutrients to the currents. Sediment drifted down in patient grains, covering what little remained until even those faint traces blurred into indistinguishable layers of mud. Stone would later form from that mud, but stone would remember almost nothing. The fossil record of the Proterozoic oceans feels like a shoreline erased by fog. There are hints of life everywhere. Chemical whispers embedded in rock, subtle distortions in ancient sediments where microbial mats once held the seafloor together. But the forms themselves remain largely invisible. It was a living world, a complex one. Yet it moved through time like a dream that leaves only a faint emotion after waking. Within those ancient waters, ecosystems unfolded slowly across immense distances. Sunlit shallows supported vast microbial landscapes where cyanobacteria continued their quiet labour of breathing oxygen into the atmosphere. Below them, deeper layers of water remained darker, richer with sulfur and methane, where other microbial communities thrived using chemical pathways that modern oceans rarely see. The planet hosted multiple oceans within the same ocean, different chemistries, different metabolisms, different invisible cities of life. Some regions of the sea were oxygenated and bright, others remained shadowed, filled with dissolved metals and chemical gradients rising from hydrothermal vents where the crust opened gently to the deep. A life adapted to every pocket of possibility, and evolution, patient as always, experimented. Certain cells gathered together into colonies, others stretched themselves into filaments that swayed slowly with underwater currents. Some began to specialize, cells at one end performing one task, cells at another carrying out a different function. Cooperation emerged, not with intention, but with persistence. These cooperative assemblies were the earliest whispers of multicellularity, soft clusters of cells learning how to behave as a single organism rather than a loose gathering of individuals. Such bodies were fragile. A sudden change in temperature, a shift in salinity, a grazing microbe, any of these could dissolve the experiment back into its original pieces. But across millions of years, the experiments continued. That because time was abundant. The oceans held nearly 1 billion years of evolutionary quiet before the Cambrian animals arrived. 1 billion years is long enough for entire evolutionary branches to rise and fall many times over. And if those branches never built hard skeletons, the sea would carry them away without leaving a fossil behind. This possibility drifts through the study of early life like a slow-moving current. The fossil record feels incomplete not because life was absent, but because preservation was rare. Most organisms that have ever lived on Earth never became fossils. They simply vanished. Their bodies recycled into the endless chemistry of the biosphere. Only under exceptional circumstances does nature preserve a body long enough for minerals to replace its structure and turn it into stone. Rapid burial, low oxygen. A fine sediment. A precise balance of conditions rarely sustained across large ecosystems, which means entire communities may have existed without ever entering the geological archive. Forests of soft organisms, mobile bodies without shells, delicate predators feeding upon fragile prey. If such ecosystems flourished briefly in the pre-Cambrian oceans, their presence could dissolve almost entirely from the record. Only subtle chemical disturbances would remain. Strange shifts in carbon cycles, unexpected pulses of oxygen, moments where the planet's chemistry seems to breathe differently for a time, and indeed, the rocks show these breaths. Across the Proterozoic sediments, isotopic curves rise and fall like slow waves across deep time. Some represent known biological revolutions, the spread of oxygen-producing microbes, to the emergence of new metabolic pathways. Others remain difficult to explain. Small anomalies, gentle disturbances in the planetary cycles of carbon and sulfur. Perhaps they were caused by microbial blooms, or environmental shifts, or something more complex that left no skeleton behind. The sea offers no answers, only silence. Because water is not a careful historian, it is a dissolving one. Its memory exists not in preserved forms, but in faint chemical fingerprints scattered through stone like distant echoes. And somewhere inside those echoes lies a quiet uncertainty. The possibility that life experimented with complexity long before the Cambrian world hardened its bodies into fossil memory. Perhaps those early experiments were brief. Perhaps they flourished for millions of years. Perhaps entire evolutionary stories rose and fell beneath waves that have long since forgotten their names. Because the ocean does not resist forgetting, it practices it endlessly. Each tide arriving to smooth the surface once more. Beneath the ancient sky, the oceans moved with a patience that felt almost eternal. Currents flowed slowly through the deep basins of the planet, carrying minerals, nutrients, and the faint breath of distant ecosystems across waters that had never known ships or storms shaped by human memory. The sea in those ages belonged entirely to time. No creature with eyes looked up at the surface. No swimmer crossed vast distances in search of prey. Movement existed, but it was subtle, gentle, cells drifting, filaments swaying. The soft organisms resting quietly upon the seafloor where microbial mats spread like living skin across the sediment. The world felt suspended in a long inhalation. Life existed everywhere, but it did not yet fill the oceans with the restless energy that later ages would bring. Instead, it lingered close to the rhythms of chemistry. Sunlight touched the shallow waters, feeding cyanobacteria that continued releasing oxygen into the atmosphere above. That oxygen, once rare, now moved through the upper layers of the sea, like a new kind of weather, sometimes abundant, sometimes withdrawn again into deeper chemical cycles. The balance was delicate. The oceans were not yet fully oxygenated. And many deeper regions remained shadowed worlds where ancient microbial metabolism still dominated, organisms breathing sulfur or methylmethane rather than oxygen, shaping ecosystems that modern oceans barely resemble. The sea was layered not just by depth, but by breadth. Different atmospheres within the same water, different possibilities for life unfolding side by side, and within those possibilities, evolution wandered. Some organisms remained solitary cells drifting through the planktonic haze of the upper waters. Others gathered together into colonies that shared nutrients and signals across their membranes. In rare moments, those colonies became something more coordinated. Cells began to specialize. Some absorbed energy. Some anchored the organism in place. Others carried out internal processes that supported the whole. So these early multicellular forms were delicate architectures of cooperation. Living tapestries woven from thousands or millions of cells working together in slow harmony. Yet their bodies were soft. Softness is the enemy of fossilization. When such organisms died, the sea dismantled them quickly. Bacteria returned their molecules to the surrounding water. Currents scattered what remained. The sediment closed quietly above them, leaving no shape behind. And so the stone that would later form from those sediments remembers only faint disturbances, small ripples in the layering of ancient mud, tiny chemical deviations, hints that life once touched that place without revealing what form it took. Over time, entire stretches of the geological record appear almost empty. There are millions upon millions of years where the rocks show little more than simple microbial structures and subtle isotopic patterns. These gaps are not necessarily moments when life disappeared. More often they are moments when life left no durable signature. The ocean continued breathing. The ecosystems continued shifting. But the archive of stone remained mostly blank. And this is the quiet paradox of Earth's history. Life may have been extraordinarily active during ages that geology remembers only as silence. The deeper the past becomes, the more fragile the record grows. Continents rise and erode. Ocean floors slide slowly back into the mantle, where heat transforms their sediments into new minerals. Each cycle erases another layer of the planet's earlier memory. Over billions of years, entire surfaces vanish. The oldest ocean floors that exist today are only about 200 million years old, a mere whisper compared to the vast stretches of time before the Cambrian. Every sea floor that existed prior to that has already been recycled, subducted, melted, returned to the interior of the Earth. If complex ecosystems once flourished across those vanished ocean basins, the planet may have already consumed their remains completely. Stone cannot preserve what no longer exists, and so the ocean remains the great dissolver of stories, a place where life thrives and then disappears without resistance. Even today, most of the creatures drifting through modern seas will leave no fossils behind. Their bodies will dissolve into nutrients long before sediment has the chance to record their presence. The same was true, perhaps even more so, during the ancient ages before skeletons evolved. The Precambrian ocean was a soft world, a world where bodies were made mostly of water, protein, and delicate membranes, a world where death returned quickly to the endless cycle of chemistry, which means the vast stretches of geological silence may not represent emptiness at all. They may represent abundance, an abundance too fragile to survive burial. Somewhere within those silent ages, evolution was preparing something extraordinary. New interactions, new ecological pressures, the subtle beginnings of predation, movement, defense to arms races that would eventually transform the peaceful microbial seas into ecosystems filled with motion and struggle. But those tensions had not yet fully emerged. However, the ocean still lingered in a quieter state, soft bodies drifting, delicate organisms absorbing sunlight or nutrients from the water around them, and the waves above, indifferent as always, continued smoothing the surface of the sea. Because water does not keep monuments, it keeps only motion, and the deeper the story sinks into time, the more gently the ocean lets it fade. The ocean does not rush its forgetting. It lets memory dissolve slowly. A body settles into the water, the muscles loosen, the tissues soften, and the quiet workers of the sea begin their patient work. Microbes arrive first, drawn not by intention but by chemistry. They disassemble the architecture of life molecule by molecule until only faint shadows remain within the sediment below. Even those petals rarely survive. The ocean is a place where structure returns easily to fluid, and for most of Earth's history, life itself shared that softness. Long before skeletons hardened the bodies of animals, organisms lived within forms that were closer to water than stone. Flexible membranes, gentle tissues, delicate symmetries shaped by currents rather than gravity. Such bodies were never meant to last. They were meant to live briefly, to move nutrients through ecosystems, to dissolve again into the great chemical breathing of the planet. This softness shaped the way early life moved through time. Entire biological worlds could rise, flourish, and fade without leaving a single fossil behind. Millions of years could pass where evolution experimented with strange and unfamiliar forms, and only for those forms to vanish so completely that the rocks would later appear empty. The ocean floor during the late Proterozoic was not barren, it was layered with life. Microbial mats spread across sediments like living tapestries, stabilizing the mud and trapping tiny grains carried by distant currents. These mats were ecosystems unto themselves, complex communities where bacteria, archaea, and early eukaryotic cells interacted in ways that modern science still struggles to fully understand. Within these microbial cities, energy flowed quietly. Sunlight filtered down through shallow waters, feeding photosynthetic organisms that released oxygen into the sea. Beneath them, deeper layers of the mat remained darker and richer, with chemical gradients where sulfur and methane metabolisms thrived, and multiple worlds stacked atop one another, multiple chemistries breathing through the same thin sheet of living matter. Above these mats, soft-bodied organisms sometimes rested like drifting leaves upon the sediment. Some may have absorbed nutrients directly from the microbial layers beneath them. Others may have filtered microscopic life from the surrounding water. A few perhaps moved slowly across the seafloor, grazing upon bacterial films in journeys so gentle they left almost no disturbance behind. Movement in those ages was subtle. Predation had not yet taken hold with the force it would later unleash. There were few shells to crack, few armoured bodies to resist consumption. The ecosystems remained balanced and in ways that feel almost serene when imagined now. But serenity in biology is rarely permanent. Within the quiet interactions of those early communities, new pressures slowly emerged. Some organisms developed ways to protect themselves, thicker tissues, more elaborate structures within their bodies, subtle chemical defenses against microbial attack. Others evolved methods of feeding more efficiently, extending filaments or surface areas that allowed them to gather nutrients from wider regions of water or sediment. Every small adaptation reshaped the ecosystem around it. A slightly more effective grazer could reduce microbial populations in one region, allowing other organisms to flourish. A new metabolic pathway could shift chemical balances in the water, altering the energy available to entire communities. Evolution does not leap, it accumulates. Tiny adjustments layered across immense stretches of time. Although the oceans during this era were laboratories of quiet change, a billion years of experimentation unfolding beneath the waves that never noticed. And yet, despite all that biological activity, the fossil record remains largely silent. The sediments from these ages often contain only the faintest signs of life, subtle textures in the rock where microbial mats once stabilized the seafloor, delicate distortions known as microbially induced sedimentary structures. These structures reveal that life was there. They reveal that organisms shaped the sediment. But they rarely reveal the bodies themselves. The forms are gone. Only the influence remains. And sometimes even that influence disappears as tectonic forces slowly reclaim the ocean floor. Most of the ancient seabeds where early life flourished no longer exist. And over hundreds of millions of years they were drawn downward into the mantle through the slow machinery of plate tectonics. Heat transformed their sediments. Pressure rearranged their minerals. The faint biological fingerprints they once carried blurred into geological anonymity. The Earth is not a museum, it is a recycler. The deeper the past becomes, the fewer traces survive, which means the ocean's silence before the Cambrian may not represent the absence of life, but rather the absence of preservation. Life could have wandered through countless forms, some complex, some strange, some perhaps approaching the coordinated behaviours that later animals would display. Yet without skeletons, those experiments dissolved. The sea accepted them the way it accepts every falling body, quietly, completely, leaving only chemistry behind. And chemistry speaks softly. It murmurs through isotopes and subtle mineral signatures buried within layers of stone. Those murmurs hint at ecosystems changing, at biological processes shaping the atmosphere and oceans in ways that cannot always be explained by simple microbial worlds alone. But the details remain hidden, like shapes moving beneath deep water, seen only for a moment before the surface grows calm again. The oceans that carried those early experiments were never designed to preserve them. They were designed to keep moving, to erase, to transform. And so the deeper the story sinks into the sea of time, the more gently it disappears, until only a quiet question remains beneath the waves. What else once lived here before the planet learned how to remember? In the slow breathing of the ancient seas, the time gathered like mist over quiet water. The surface of the ocean reflected the sky that had already watched billions of sunsets. Beneath that reflection, the deep moved in darkness older than memory. Currents travelled patiently between continents that no longer exist, carrying warmth, minerals, and the faint exhalations of life across distances too vast for any organism to comprehend. The sea had become a world unto itself, a layered silence. Above, the shallows shimmered with sunlight where microbial architects continued their long work. Cyanobacteria spread across warm waters, weaving invisible tapestries of life that fed on light and exhaled oxygen into the sky. Below them, other worlds lingered. Depths where sunlight never entered. Depths where oxygen still struggled to reach. There. Their ancient metabolisms endured. Organisms breathing sulfur or iron, quietly shaping chemical cycles that modern oceans remember only faintly. Each layer of the sea held a different story. Each depth, a different language of life. And between those layers drifted the early experiments of multicellular existence. Soft organisms that rested upon sediments or swayed gently in the currents like underwater leaves. They had no eyes, no jaws, no shells. Their bodies were quiet arrangements of cells cooperating through chemical whispers. Signals passed from one part of the organism to another, guiding growth, repair, and the slow exchange of nutrients. In those faint communications lay the earliest beginnings of something that would one day become nerves, muscles, movement. But in this older ocean, the conversation remained simple. That the bodies were patient, the ecosystems gentle. A creature might live its entire life anchored to a single patch of sediment, absorbing nutrients from the surrounding water or from microbial communities that blanketed the seafloor. Movement, when it occurred, was slow enough to feel almost like growth, a gradual sliding across the surface of the mud, a drifting repositioning in response to currents. Nothing rushed, because nothing needed to. Predators were rare, defense was subtle. The world had not yet discovered the fierce competition that would later ripple through the Cambrian seas. Instead, the ecosystems felt almost contemplative, life occupying space without urgency, organisms rising and fading like quiet thoughts upon the surface of deep time. But beneath that calm, the planet itself continued its slow transformations. Continents drifted, mountains rose and crumbled back into sediment. Volcanoes exhaled minerals into the sea. Every geological movement reshaped the chemistry of the oceans, and chemistry in turn reshaped the possibilities for life. Occasionally the balance shifted dramatically. Ice advanced across the planet in immense glaciations that may have wrapped the Earth in frozen silence. The oceans cooled. Sunlight dimmed beneath layers of ice that stretched from pole to equator. Some scientists call this time the snowball Earth, a world where even the seas may have frozen across vast distances, yet life endured, hidden beneath the ice, clinging to hydrothermal warmth along deep seafloor vents, where the crust opened gently to release heat from the mantle below. The biosphere contracted but did not vanish. It waited. And when the ice finally retreated, when sunlight returned to open water and nutrients flooded back into the seas, life responded. New ecosystems spread across the recovering oceans. Multicellular organisms appeared more frequently in the sediments of the late Proterozoic world. The Ediacaran forms returned, fronds rising into the water column, disc-shaped bodies resting quietly on the seafloor, quilted organisms whose internal symmetry remains difficult to understand even today. The ocean floor became a quiet garden of unfamiliar shapes, but these gardens did not last forever. Somewhere near the boundary of the Cambrian period, the ecosystems changed again. The soft-bodied Ediacaran organisms faded. In their place appeared new forms, creatures with mineralized shells, so protective armor and bodies designed for movement rather than stillness. The seas awakened. Predation arrived. Eyes began to evolve, turning light into information. Jaws and grasping appendages followed, reshaping the gentle ecosystems into landscapes of pursuit and defense. Life hardened. And once it hardened, the rocks finally learned how to remember. Shells resisted decay, bones endured burial. Skeletons left clear impressions within the sediments that would later transform into stone. The fossil record blossomed suddenly with diversity. Trilobites scuttled across the seafloor. Worms burrowed through the mud. Strange armoured creatures swam through waters that had once hosted only drifting softness. It was as though the planet had turned a page, but the page that came before remained blurred. The oceans that carried the earliest experiments of complex life had already practiced their forgetting. They had dissolved countless bodies before skeletons existed to resist the tide. And so the Cambrian world appears in the fossil record like the sudden beginning of a story that had already been unfolding for a very long time. The oceans had been preparing for it, quietly, patiently, for hundreds of millions of years. Yet what truly lived within those earlier seas, the delicate organisms, the vanished ecosystems, the soft experiments of evolution, remains hidden beneath layers of geological silence. Because the sea does not hold on to every story, it lets them pass, like waves smoothing the sand after a long night of wind. and beneath those vanished tides, the deepest memories of life still drift, not in bones. Not in shells, but in whispers of chemistry buried quietly within the stone. Somewhere in that silence, the earliest chapters of complexity still sleep. The sea has always been patient with time. It does not hurry toward the future. It does not cling to the past. Instead, it moves in slow circles of return, currents carrying warmth across hemispheres, tides lifting and lowering the same water again and again beneath the moon's quiet pull. For billions of years, these waters have moved above stories that no longer exist. Mountains have fallen into them. Forests have sunk beneath them. Entire continents have drifted across their surfaces and then vanished again through the slow swallowing motion of tectonic plates. But perhaps the most delicate stories the sea has ever carried were the earliest experiments of complex life. Had soft bodies, fragile architectures of cells cooperating for the first time in ways that hinted at something larger. Those organisms lived in oceans that had not yet learned how to preserve them. And so the water accepted them gently when their brief lives ended. A body resting on the seafloor might remain visible only for a short while. Microbial scavengers would arrive first, breaking down tissues that had taken years to grow. Currents would pass overhead, shifting fine grains of sediment that slowly buried what little remained. Soon there would be nothing. No bones, no shells, no durable imprint left behind. Only the faint rearrangement of chemistry in the surrounding mud. Later, over millions of years, that mud would harden into rock, but the body itself would be gone. The sea had already taken it back. Yet this quiet disappearance may have happened countless times during the immense ages before the Cambrian. Across continental shelves and shallow lagoons, soft ecosystems may have flourished for millions of years at a time. Organisms growing, reproducing, interacting, in ways that slowly reshaped their environment. Predation may have begun in gentle forms long before teeth or claws appeared, organisms absorbing nutrients from the bodies of others, or grazing across microbial mats in slow movements that left only faint disturbances in the sediment. Competition may have existed too, different species reaching for the same sunlight, the same dissolved minerals, the same narrow patches of seafloor where life could anchor itself against the passing currents, but without skeletons the drama remained invisible. And evolution's earliest conflicts were fought in bodies too soft to endure the long patience of geology, and so the record of those conflicts dissolved. Only later, when mineralized structures appeared, would the struggle of life become visible in stone. Shells are stubborn things, bones endure, teeth survive burial. But softness belongs to water. The oceans before the Cambrian were filled with softness. The sediments that accumulated during those ages carry faint echoes of what once lived above them. Tiny chemical signatures, subtle distortions in the layering of ancient mud, where microbial communities once stabilized the seafloor. But the organisms themselves have vanished. Even the rare fossils from the Ediacaran period feel ghost-like. Flat impression, gentle outlines, their shapes pressed into ancient seabeds as though life itself had briefly leaned against the earth before rising again into the current. Many of those organisms disappeared entirely when the Cambrian world began. Their forms left no descendants that can be clearly recognized today. They belong to a chapter of life that closed quietly, just as the next chapter opened with sudden clarity. And that transition, this movement from softness into hardness, remains one of the most mysterious transformations in Earth's history. Why did skeletons evolve when they did? Why did complexity suddenly appear in forms that the rocks could finally remember? Perhaps it was oxygen reaching new levels within the oceans, allowing organisms to build mineralized structures more easily. Perhaps it was the arrival of predators that forced prey species to develop protective shells and armor. Perhaps it was simply an evolutionary threshold, millions of years of gradual experimentation finally crossing into a new possibility. Whatever the cause, the change altered the memory of the planet. For the first time, life began leaving durable signatures within the sediment. The ocean floor, once a place where bodies dissolved almost instantly, became a canvas where shells and bones could rest long enough to fossilize. Stone learned how to remember, and once it began remembering, the story of life appeared to erupt suddenly across the fossil record. The Cambrian Explosion. A moment when animals with eyes, limbs, and skeletons appeared across the ocean in astonishing diversity. But the oceans that produced those creatures had already spent billions of years practicing their forgetting. The earlier chapters of evolution had unfolded quietly beneath waves that carried no monuments. If complex ecosystems rose and fell during those ancient ages, the sea would have allowed them to disappear without resistance. Because the ocean does not preserve everything, it preserves almost nothing, and the deeper the story sinks into time, the more completely the water lets it go. Somewhere beneath the Cambrian layers, beneath the shells and bones that fill the fossil archives of museums, lies a softer world. A world where life was already old, already experimenting, already searching for new forms within fragile bodies that drifted through quiet seas. The oceans carried those experiments patiently, and then they forgot them, like tides smoothing the shore before dawn. But the rocks that remain still hold faint echoes of that lost ocean, echoes that lead deeper into the next mystery. Because if the oceans forgot, the stones may have forgotten even more, and somewhere in that forgotten space lies the silent gap in the Book of Earth itself. Some truths are not erased, they are simply buried beneath silence. The fossil gap in the Book of Stone appears permanent. Mountains rise like frozen waves across the continents. Cliffs hold their faces against wind and rain for ages that feel eternal to the passing generations of life. Even a small pebble can seem ancient when held in a quiet hand. But the planet does not treat stone as permanent. It treats it as temporary memory, across deep time. The surface of the Earth is less like a library and more like a shoreline. Pages are written into sediment, hardened into rock, lifted into mountains, and then slowly worn away again. Wind carries grains of those mountains into rivers. Rivers carry them back to the sea. The sea buries them beneath quiet layers that will one day become new stone. The story begins again. Because of this endless cycle, most of Earth's past has vanished. The earliest ocean floors, the places where ancient sediments once settled, have almost entirely disappeared. They slipped beneath the edges of continents, drawn slowly downward into the mantle through subduction zones, where stone softens, melts, and becomes something new. The planet consumes its own memory. What remains is only a scattering of fragments. The small islands of ancient crust where rocks survived the recycling of the surface. These fragments are precious to those who study the earliest history of life. They are the few surviving pages from chapters written billions of years ago. But even those pages are damaged, folded, blurred by heat and pressure. Metamorphism, one of geology's quiet transformations, changes rocks from within. Minerals rearrange themselves. Sedimentary layers twist and stretch. Fossils that may once have rested clearly within the stone dissolve into abstract patterns. The longer a rock exists, the more it changes, and the deeper it travels through the machinery of the Earth, the less it resembles the moment when it first formed. This is why the earliest fossil record feels so incomplete. Life may have existed in complex forms long before the Cambrian seas filled with skeleton-bearing animals, but the rocks that could have preserved those earlier organisms may no longer exist. They may have melted, or fractured, or returned entirely to the mantle beneath continents that drifted away long ago. The fossil record, then, is not a perfect archive. It is a surviving fragment of a much larger story, a few pages left behind after the rest of the book has been burned. And those surviving pages contain strange silences. There are moments in Earth's geological timeline where the rocks speak clearly, layers filled with shells, bones, footprints, and impressions of ancient bodies resting in sediment. But before those layers, the record grows faint, then quiet, then almost... For nearly 3 billion years of Earth's history, life existed mostly in forms too delicate to fossilize easily. Microbial mats, drifting cells, soft colonies of cooperating organisms, these filled the oceans long before skeletons appeared. The stone remembers their presence mostly through indirect signs. Subtle textures in sediment where microbial communities once held the seafloor together. Chemical fingerprints embedded within minerals. Occasionally rare impressions of soft organisms preserved under exceptional conditions. But entire stretches of time pass with almost no visible organisms preserved at all. This absence has long puzzled those who study the origins of complex life. If evolution had billions of years to experiment before the Cambrian Explosion, why do the rocks reveal so few intermediate forms? And why does the fossil record seem to move from microscopic life directly into animals with eyes, shells, and articulated limbs? Perhaps the answer lies not in the suddenness of evolution, but in the quiet selectiveness of preservation. The fossil record favours hardness, teeth, shells, bones. Minerals resist decay long enough to survive burial beneath layers of sediment that protect them from scavengers and erosion. Soft bodies rarely endure this process. They collapse quickly. Even in modern oceans where countless organisms live and die every day, only a tiny fraction ever become fossils. The rest vanish completely. Imagine then the ancient seas before skeletons existed. Soft ecosystems stretching across shallow, continental shelves. Communities of organisms made almost entirely of water and delicate tissue. And if those bodies died, the ocean would dismantle them within hours or days. Currents would carry their molecules away. Sediment would settle quietly across the seafloor, leaving little trace of what once lived there. Millions of years of life could pass across that seafloor without producing a single fossil. And when the oceanic crust eventually sank back into the mantle, even the faintest hints would disappear. This is the fossil gap. Not necessarily a gap in life itself, but a gap in the planet's ability to remember. Between the earliest microbial worlds and the dramatic blossoming of the Cambrian seas lies an enormous span of time where complexity may have been experimenting quietly beyond the reach of stone. Bodies forming, adapting, perhaps even interacting in ways that hinted at intelligence or coordinated behaviour. But without skeletons, those possibilities dissolved. The rocks offer no clear shapes, only whispers. And yet those whispers remain intriguing, because the deeper scientists look into the chemical memory of ancient rocks, the more they find signs that something was stirring in the oceans long before the fossil record learned how to see it. The stone may have forgotten the bodies, but it may still remember their influence. And within that influence lies the next layer of the story, because even when fossils vanish, chemistry sometimes remembers. Some truths are not lost, they are simply folded into the quiet language of atoms. The planet keeps its deepest memories in places where eyes rarely look, not upon the surface where wind and rain slowly erase the shapes of mountains, and not within the shallow soils where forests rise and vanish in the brief rhythm of seasons. The oldest memories lie deeper, buried in layers of stone that settled quietly beneath ancient oceans long before animals learned how to leave bones behind. Yet even there, memory is fragile. Sediment falls slowly through water. A grain of silt drifts downward, touches the seafloor, and comes to rest beside countless others. Over years, centuries, and then millions of years, those grains press gently together until mud becomes stone. This is how most fossils are born. A body rests upon the sediment. Mud settles over it before decay can erase its shape. Minerals seep into the spaces where tissue once lived. Stone forms, and the body becomes a memory. But in the earliest oceans, bodies rarely remained long enough for that quiet transformation to begin. Soft organisms collapse quickly. Bacteria return their molecules to the surrounding water. Currents shift the sediment. The moment of preservation passes, and so the early stone remains largely empty. Yet the rock still carries something else, a quieter kind of evidence, chemistry. Atoms remember where bodies once breathed. When organisms live and grow, they interact with the elements around them. Carbon passes through cells, sulfur moves through metabolic pathways, oxygen reshapes the minerals that form beneath ancient seas. These movements leave traces, not shapes, not skeletons, but patterns. Within certain ancient rocks, scientists can measure subtle variations in isotopes, different forms of the same element that behave slightly differently during biological processes. Carbon, for example, carries a memory of life's presence. Living cells prefer lighter carbon isotopes when building their structures. Over immense spans of time, this preference alters the balance of carbon trapped in sediments. When geologists examine ancient rocks, they sometimes find these faint signatures, chemical imprints left behind by organisms that no longer exist. The oldest of these signals reach back more than 3.5 billion years. They whisper of life at a time when the planet itself was still young. But as time moves forward through the Proterozoic eon, the chemical story grows more complex. Carbon curves rise and fall across layers of stone. The sulfur isotopes shift in ways that hint at changing ecosystems. Oxygen appears more frequently within minerals that once formed beneath ancient seas. Each fluctuation is like a quiet breath in the geological record. Something changed, something moved through the biosphere strongly enough to reshape the chemistry of the planet. Yet the bodies responsible remain unseen. This is the strange tension within the fossil gap. The chemistry suggests life was active, sometimes dramatically so, but the fossils themselves remain scarce. At certain moments in the Proterozoic timeline, the planet seems to experience enormous shifts in its biological cycles. Carbon isotopes swing suddenly toward lighter forms, suggesting massive burial of organic matter somewhere in the oceans. These events are called carbon excursions. They are like sudden pulses in the heartbeat of the planet. Something was happening within the biosphere that altered the global carbon cycle on a scale large enough to leave fingerprints across continents. Entire ecosystems may have expanded rapidly, or collapsed, or transformed in ways that modern science still struggles to explain. But without bodies preserved in stone, the details remain hidden. The rocks show the shadow of activity without revealing the actors themselves. Imagine hearing distant footsteps in darkness without seeing who walks there. The presence is undeniable, but the form remains invisible. Some researchers wonder whether these chemical disturbances might hint at evolutionary experiments that briefly flourished before disappearing, perhaps early multicellular ecosystems spread across continental shelves, and altering nutrient cycles and oxygen levels before environmental shifts erased them. Perhaps new metabolic pathways appeared among ancient organisms, reshaping the chemistry of the oceans for a time, or perhaps the changes were driven entirely by microbial worlds far more complex than once imagined. The truth remains difficult to grasp, because chemistry speaks in whispers, and whispers rarely reveal the whole story. The deeper the rocks sink into time, the softer their voices become, yet they continue to murmur. In certain formations older than 600 million years, scientists have discovered chemical traces of complex molecules known as steranes, fragments derived from sterols that are typically produced by eukaryotic cells. These molecules hint that complex life may have been widespread long before the Cambrian animals arrived. But molecules cannot reveal the shapes of the organisms that created them. They reveal presence, not form, and so the fossil gap remains. A vast stretch of Earth's history where life clearly existed, where evolution was clearly unfolding, but where the stone struggles to preserve the bodies themselves. It is a silence filled with motion, an emptiness that may once have been crowded with living things too delicate to endure the long patience of geology. The Earth does not hide these stories intentionally. It simply moves. Mountains rise, oceans shift, crust melts and reforms, memory becomes mineral, and within that constant transformation entire chapters fade. And yet the faint chemical echoes remain, guiding the search deeper into the quiet language of ancient stone. Because if fossils vanished and bodies dissolved, the atoms themselves may still carry traces of what once lived here. And sometimes, those traces begin to reveal something unexpected, something that suggests the oceans of the distant past may have been far more complicated than the silence of stone first implied. But chemistry is only the beginning of that deeper memory. Beyond it lies another question. What if intelligence itself, soft, fragile, and temporary, once moved through bodies the rocks were never able to preserve? Some possibilities do not vanish, they simply drift, just beyond the edge of what stone can remember. There are places in the earth where time feels thinner. The cliffs, where layers of stone stack quietly upon one another, each band marking a different age of oceans that once covered the land. In those cliffs, geologists sometimes read the planet the way a patient reader studies an old manuscript, line by line, grain by grain. But the deeper the pages go, the more incomplete the manuscript becomes. Whole chapters are missing, sometimes entire volumes. The fossil gap before the Cambrian is not a single absence. It is a wide and uneven quiet that stretches across immense spans of time. Some layers contain faint impressions of soft organisms pressed gently into ancient mud. Others hold only the subtle fingerprints of microbial communities that once stabilized the seafloor. And between these rare signals lie long intervals where the rock says almost nothing at all. Yet even silence has texture. The sediments of the Proterozoic oceans reveal landscapes that once existed beneath shallow water. Ripple marks where currents brushed across soft mud. Thin laminations where microbial mats trapped fine grains drifting down from distant shores. These surfaces were once alive. They were floors of ecosystems where organisms rested, fed, and perhaps slowly moved across the sediment, but the bodies themselves rarely survived. Occasionally a delicate outline appears, a faint impression preserved under unusual conditions where burial happened quickly and decay slowed just enough for stone to keep the shape. These rare fossils are among the most mysterious forms in the history of life. The Ediacaran organisms. They lived roughly 600 million years ago, just before the Cambrian transformation reshaped the oceans. Some of them resembled fronds rising from the seafloor like quiet underwater plants. Others appeared as soft discs pressed into the sediment. Still others displayed repeating segments arranged in patterns that feel strangely unfamiliar to modern biology. Their bodies held no bones, no shells, no clear organs preserved in the fossil impressions, yet they grew large. Some reached the length of an arm, some lay flat across the seafloor like quilted fabrics made of living tissue. Their anatomy remains difficult to interpret even today. They do not easily resemble the animals that would soon dominate the Cambrian seas. Many lack clear heads or mouths. Some show symmetries not seen in later organisms. It is possible that many of them belong to evolutionary branches that ended before the Cambrian began. There are whole lineages that flourished briefly, and their handchest without descendants. The fossil record preserves their silhouettes, but it cannot explain them fully, and before them lies a deeper quiet still. Nearly 1 billion years where complex cells existed, where multicellular experiments likely unfolded in the oceans, yet where fossils remain almost entirely absent. During this immense stretch of time, evolution had opportunities beyond easy imagination. Continents shifted. Oceans changed their chemistry. Ice covered the planet and retreated again. Each transformation reshaped the environments where life could grow. Each shift may have encouraged new biological experiments, new body plans, new forms of cooperation between cells, new ecological relationships unfolding across shallow seas. Yet the rocks remember only fragments. Perhaps the organisms that lived during those ages remained small and soft, dissolving too quickly for preservation. Perhaps they occupied environments where sediment rarely settled in ways that would capture their shapes. Or perhaps the stone that once held their fossils no longer exists. Recycled, subducted, returned to the molten interior of the Earth where minerals rearrange themselves into entirely new forms. The fossil gap may not simply be a gap in discovery. It may be a gap in survival, a gap created by the restless motion of a planet that rarely keeps its oldest pages intact. And yet the possibility remains that complexity wandered quietly through those lost ages. Organisms experimenting with cooperation between cells, bodies forming and dissolving across ecosystems that stretched along ancient coastlines now erased by time. Perhaps some of those organisms moved slowly across the seafloor. Perhaps some absorbed nutrients from microbial mats in ways that resembled grazing. Perhaps a few developed primitive sensory systems, chemical awareness of the water around them, faint signals guiding growth or movement. Such behaviors would leave almost no trace. Soft intelligence is difficult to fossilize. Coordination between cells vanishes quickly when the body that carried it dissolves, and so the fossil gap leaves room for quiet imagination, not the dramatic kind filled with sudden civilizations or impossible machines, but something softer, something biological. An ancient biosphere exploring complexity long before the Cambrian animals hardened their bodies into stone memory. If such experiments occurred, they would have unfolded slowly, over millions of years, across oceans that carried their remains away without resistance. The planet would not have noticed. The continents would have continued drifting. Volcanoes would have breathed minerals into the sea. Ice would have advanced and retreated across the poles. Life would have changed, and the ocean would have practiced its oldest skill, forgetting. Because stone remembers only what survives, and the oldest oceans of Earth may have carried stories that were never meant to last. Stories written in bodies too soft for the patience of geology. They're stories that dissolved like mist above the water, long before the Cambrian world arrived to carve clearer lines into the Book of Stone. Some truths are not erased, they simply fade into layers that time no longer knows how to read. Stone does not speak quickly. It waits. It waits beneath rivers, beneath forests, beneath deserts where wind drifts softly across exposed cliffs. And when it finally reveals its layers, the story it offers is never complete. Whole intervals appear compressed, while others stretch into immense quiet where almost nothing seems to happen. Yet the Earth was never still. Even during the ages where the fossil record grows thin, the planet continued turning through darkness and light. Oceans breathed, continents wandered. Beneath the crust, the mantle moved slowly like a patient tide of heat carrying the foundations of mountains from one age into the next. Life existed inside all of it, but life does not always leave bones behind. During the immense spans before the Cambrian world hardened its creatures into mineral forms, bodies remained soft. They were made of water and flexible proteins. delicate membranes stretched across living cells that cooperated quietly to sustain a single organism. Such bodies were never meant for stone. When they died, the sea reclaimed them almost instantly. Microbial communities dismantled their structures piece by piece until nothing recognizable remained. Even the sediment beneath them often shifted too quickly for preservation. Currents moved, storms stirred the shallow seas, burrowing microbes churned the mud. At the moment when a fossil could form passed silently. And so the stone above those ancient oceans preserved only faint hints of activity. Occasionally a surface appears in the rock where something disturbed the sediment long ago, a shallow depression where a soft body once rested, a faint ripple in the mud where an organism may have moved across the seafloor. These are not fossils in the traditional sense. They are impressions of presence, shadows where life briefly touched the earth before dissolving again. Such impressions reveal something subtle about the ecosystems of the late Proterozoic seas. The seafloor was alive. Microbial mats formed dense living carpets that stabilized the sediment, preventing currents from easily erasing every disturbance. When a soft organism settled upon those mats, and its weight sometimes left a delicate imprint beneath the living film, if sediment arrived quickly enough, the imprint could survive burial. Stone would later hold the memory. But these moments were rare. More often, life moved across the surface and vanished without leaving a mark. Imagine an ocean floor stretching across thousands of kilometers of shallow water. Organisms drifting slowly above the microbial landscapes, feeding quietly, growing through seasons that lasted millions of years. The ecosystems may have been complex in ways difficult to imagine now, but complexity alone does not guarantee preservation. The fossil record requires stubbornness. Mineralized structures, shells that resist decay, bones that hold their shape beneath pressure. Without those structures, the archive of geology remains fragile. And this is why the Cambrian transition feels so sudden when viewed through the lens of stone. Animals with skeletons appear rapidly across the fossil record. Trilobites, brachiopods, worms, early arthropods, creatures whose bodies contained minerals strong enough to survive burial. Once skeletons existed, the sediment became a far better historian. But before skeletons, the record is quiet. Perhaps misleadingly quiet. The fossil gap may conceal ecosystems that were already experimenting with many of the biological ideas that would later define animal life. Movement, cooperation between specialized cells, the earliest forms of feeding upon other organisms, even the beginnings of sensory awareness, cells responding to chemical signals in the water, guiding bodies slowly toward food or away from danger. That such abilities could evolve long before bones appeared. They require coordination, energy, communication between cells, but none of those qualities fossilize easily. They vanish when the organism itself dissolves, and so the rocks remain largely silent about those possibilities. Only in rare sediments from the very end of the Proterozoic do clearer forms appear. The Ediacaran organisms whose strange bodies hint at a world experimenting with larger multicellular life. Even those forms remain mysterious. Many show no clear organs, no mouths, no obvious signs of predation or complex behavior. They seem almost peaceful, lying quietly upon the seafloor like living fabrics shaped by slow currents. Yet their presence reveals something important. The oceans were ready. Though the biological groundwork had already been laid across hundreds of millions of years, complex cells existed. Multicellular organisms had begun exploring new ways of inhabiting the seafloor. The ecosystems were evolving towards something, but the fossil record preserves only the final steps before that transformation became visible. Everything earlier remains blurred. The fossil gap is not simply emptiness. It is an eroded memory, a stretch of time where life may have been far more active than the rocks can show, where entire evolutionary stories may have unfolded quietly beneath oceans that practiced their oldest habit, forgetting. Because the planet does not store every chapter it writes. Some are carried away in currents, some melt deep beneath the crust, some fade into the chemistry that only faintly hints at what once lived there. Yet even in seasons, the stone holds clues that guide the search deeper into the hidden archives of the earth. Because when fossils vanish, another witness sometimes remains. Not bodies, not bones, but atoms themselves. And within those atoms lies a language even older than stone, a language that may still remember what the oceans once carried long before the Cambrian world began to speak clearly. The chemistry that might remember. When bodies vanish, atoms remain. They settle quietly within the stone, arranged in patterns that seem ordinary at first glance. Carbon beside oxygen, sulfur threaded through minerals, iron resting in silent crystals formed beneath seas that no longer exist. But atoms remember movement. They remember breath. They remember the slow work of life. Across the vast quiet of geological time, chemistry becomes a kind of whispering archive. Subtle variations in isotopes and molecules that hint at processes once unfolding in oceans far older than the Cambrian world. These memories are not sculpted shapes. They do not resemble bones or shells. They are more like faint echoes drifting through the structure of rock. And yet those echoes speak. Deep within ancient sediments, scientists sometimes find tiny differences in carbon atoms that reveal a long-vanished metabolism. Life tends to favour lighter carbon when building its tissues. When organisms live, grow and die across entire ecosystems, this preference slowly alters the balance of carbon buried in the sediment below. Over millions of years, the change becomes measurable. A quiet fingerprint of biology, even when the bodies themselves have dissolved. The oldest such fingerprints appear astonishingly early in Earth's history. In rocks more than 3.5 billion years old, carbon isotopes suggest that microbial life was already moving through the oceans while the planet itself was still young. Those organisms were small, soft, fragile beyond imagination. Yet their collective breathing altered the chemistry of the planet. Entire atmospheres changed because of them. The oxygen now drifting through forests and cities began as the quiet byproduct of ancient microbes floating beneath sunlight in shallow seas. But chemistry remembers more than breath. It also remembers transformation. Across the Proterozoic eon, strange pulses appear within the isotopic record, moments when the balance of carbon shifts dramatically across continents, separated by entire oceans. These events appear suddenly within the stone, a layer where lighter carbon becomes abundant, then another where heavier forms dominate, then balance returns once more. These are known as carbon excursions. They are like long, slow heartbeats recorded in rock. Something happened within the biosphere strongly enough to alter the chemistry of the entire planet, yet the fossils from those moments remain rare, sometimes entirely absent. The rocks reveal that life was active, but they do not reveal the shapes of the organisms responsible. Perhaps vast microbial blooms spread across ancient seas, bearing enormous quantities of organic matter within sediment. Perhaps new metabolic pathways emerged that reshape the movement of carbon through ecosystems. Or perhaps complex multicellular communities briefly flourished before environmental shifts caused them to vanish again. Chemistry cannot say, it only hints. And yet those hints grow more intriguing as the layers approach the boundary of the Cambrian world. Around 600 million years ago, the isotopic record begins to fluctuate more dramatically. Carbon swings through unusual cycles. Oxygen levels appear to rise in pulses within both ocean and atmosphere. The planet seems restless, the biosphere changing its rhythm. Some researchers suspect that these fluctuations may reflect the expansion of complex ecosystems across shallow, continental shelves. Ecosystem large enough to influence global chemical cycles, but the fossils from this time remain sparse. Soft bodies again, fragile forms that dissolve easily beneath the patient chemistry of decay, and so the chemical record becomes a guide through an invisible landscape. Atoms revealing activity where the shapes themselves have vanished. Carbon hints at life breathing across ancient seas. Sulfur suggests microbial communities altering ocean chemistry in subtle but profound ways. Even traces of ancient lipids, molecules once part of cell membranes, appear in certain rocks, leaving behind fragments of biological chemistry older than animals themselves. These molecules drift through time like small lanterns carried beneath deep water. They illuminate presence, not form, yet presence alone can be powerful. And because when chemistry speaks consistently across distant continents and immense spans of time, it reveals that the biosphere was far from simple. Life was interacting with the planet, shaping it, perhaps far more dynamically than the quiet fossil record suggests. The ancient oceans may have held ecosystems of surprising complexity, networks of organisms exchanging energy and nutrients across entire regions of the sea. Some may have been microscopic, others perhaps large but soft, forms drifting slowly above microbial landscapes, feeding, growing, reproducing across generations that left no skeleton behind. If such ecosystems existed, chemistry might still remember them. Because atoms do not forget their journeys. They carry subtle imbalances forward through time, then embedding those imbalances within stone where patient eyes can eventually discover them. The rocks cannot show the bodies, but they can show the breath, and sometimes the breath is enough to reveal that something extraordinary was happening within those silent oceans, something moving through life long before the Cambrian animals arrived to carve their skeletons into memory. The deeper the chemistry is studied, the clearer one quiet truth becomes. The story of life before the Cambrian may not be empty. It may simply be written in a language softer than fossils, a language where atoms speak slowly, and where the planet remembers not through shape, but through change. Stone holds silence, but atoms carry motion. Within every grain of ancient rock lies a record of journeys that once passed through living bodies. A carbon drifting through cells, oxygen binding and releasing within slow metabolic cycles, sulfur rising from dark ocean vents and entering the quiet breathing of microbial worlds. These journeys never truly end. Even when organisms vanish, their chemistry settles into the sediment below. Over millions of years, that sediment becomes stone, and the atoms remain arranged in patterns shaped by life long after the bodies themselves have dissolved. It is a quiet memory, a memory written not in shapes, but in balance. Deep within certain layers of Proterozoic rock, scientists find unusual disturbances in that balance. Carbon grows lighter across entire formations, as if vast amounts of biological material had once been buried quickly beneath ancient seas. Elsewhere, the sulfur isotopes shift in ways that suggest ecosystems altering the chemistry of the ocean itself. These changes do not appear in a single location. They appear across continents, across rocks separated by thousands of kilometers, which means the processes responsible were not small. They were planetary. Something was happening within the biosphere strong enough to reshape the movement of elements across the Earth. And yet, when the rock is examined for fossils from those same intervals, there is often very little to see. Perhaps a faint microbial texture, perhaps nothing at all. The atoms remember activity that the fossils cannot show. This tension between chemical evidence and physical absence has become one of the most intriguing mysteries of early life, because chemistry rarely exaggerates. And if isotopic balances shift across the planet, something real must have caused it. Something living, something breathing through the oceans of that distant world. One possibility is that the microbial biosphere itself was far more complex than once imagined. Billions of microscopic organisms interacting across enormous ecosystems could have altered the global cycles of carbon, sulfur, and oxygen through their collective metabolism. The microbial world is powerful in its quiet way. Even today, microbes drive many of the chemical processes that sustain life on Earth. But another possibility lingers gently within the silence. Perhaps larger organisms were already present in those ancient oceans, soft-bodied creatures spreading across shallow seafloors in ecosystems that left almost no fossils behind, bodies that fed, grew, dim and died across millions of years while influencing nutrient cycles and oxygen levels within the surrounding water. Such organisms would have been fragile, soft tissues dissolving quickly, delicate structures collapsing before burial could preserve them. Yet their collective presence might still have shaped the chemistry of the oceans. Large populations of multicellular life could alter carbon burial rates. They could influence oxygen production and consumption. They could change the structure of ecosystems in ways that ripple outward into planetary cycles. And those ripples might remain long after the organisms themselves are gone. Chemistry becomes the faint shadow of vanished biology. In certain rocks from the late Proterozoic, the molecular fossils, tiny remnants of ancient biological molecules, offer another glimpse into this hidden world. Fragments of sterols, compounds typically produced by eukaryotic organisms, appear embedded within sediments hundreds of millions of years older than the Cambrian Explosion. These molecules suggest that complex cells had already spread widely across the oceans long before skeleton-bearing animals arrived. The biosphere was not simple. It had already become layered, diverse, active in ways that left subtle fingerprints upon the chemistry of the planet. Yet the fossil record still whispers almost nothing about the bodies themselves. It is as if the shapes moved through water too gently to leave marks, as if entire ecosystems rose and faded like mist above the sea. And perhaps that is not surprising. Their softer bodies belong to water. They live within it. They dissolve into it. Their architecture is temporary, built from flexible tissues that return quickly to the chemical cycles from which they came. Stone remembers hardness, but life spent billions of years exploring softness first. Those ages of softness may have contained experiments more intricate than the rocks can reveal. Cells learning to communicate across tissues, colonies organizing themselves into coordinated forms, organisms responding to subtle signals within the water around them, gradients of nutrients, light filtering through shallow seas, the presence of other living bodies nearby. Such awareness would leave no fossil. It would exist only within living tissue, and once the tissue dissolves, the behavior disappears with it, yet the chemical ripples remain. The isotopic signatures embedded within ancient rock continue to hint that something dynamic unfolded within the oceans before the Cambrian world hardened life into skeletons, a biosphere stirring with activity, breathing deeply, reshaping the planet in ways that even today can still be measured. Atoms are patient witnesses. They carry their imbalances forward through time. They settle quietly within stone, and millions of years later they whisper, "Something lived here. Something changed the sea. Something moved through these waters long before the fossil record learned how to see it." The chemistry remembers motion, but it does not reveal the forms that moved, and so the question lingers gently within the quiet archive of the earth. And if the oceans once held bodies too soft for stone, if chemistry alone carries the memory of their presence, what kinds of lives might have drifted through those ancient seas before skeletons made the history of life visible? Some possibilities remain folded within silence, not lost, just waiting beneath deeper layers of time. Long after bodies vanish, balance remains. The oceans of the ancient Earth were vast reservoirs of elements moving slowly through endless cycles. Carbon drifted between air, water, and living cells. Oxygen rose and fell like a quiet tide in the atmosphere. Sulfur wandered through sediments and seawater in pathways shaped by invisible microbial hands. Each cycle left its imprint, not dramatic, not loud, but steady enough to become visible when stone preserved the record. The chemistry of the planet, in this way, behaves like a slow pulse beneath the surface of time, a pulse that reveals the presence of life even when the forms of life themselves have dissolved. During the long ages before the Cambrian seas blossomed with skeleton-bearing creatures, that pulse changed several times. The changes appear in layers of rock across the world, subtle shifts in isotopes that mark moments when the biosphere rearranged itself. Sometimes the change was gentle, sometimes sudden. A layer of stone forms where lighter carbon isotopes appear in abundance, suggesting that vast amounts of organic matter had been buried beneath sediment. Such burial removes carbon from the atmosphere and oceans, allowing oxygen levels to rise. The planet inhales. Then another layer appears where heavier isotopes dominate, hinting that ecosystems shifted again, and releasing carbon back into circulation. The planet exhales. These breaths unfold across millions of years, yet they suggest something important. Life before the Cambrian was not static. It moved. It expanded. It reorganized the chemistry of the oceans in ways large enough to ripple across continents. The biosphere had already become powerful, perhaps more powerful than the fossil record alone reveals. If billions of microorganisms were responsible for these chemical pulses, their collective activity would have shaped the planet in profound ways. Microbial ecosystems today still influence atmospheric chemistry, ocean nutrients, and the balance of gases that make the Earth habitable. But the ancient biosphere may have included more than microbes alone. Complex cells had already appeared by this time. That eukaryotic organisms, cells with internal compartments and specialized structures, were drifting through the oceans hundreds of millions of years before the Cambrian explosion. Some formed colonies, some grew larger, some began exploring the possibilities of multicellular life. These organisms left only faint chemical traces, fragments of lipids, sterols, molecular remnants preserved within ancient sediments like distant lanterns glowing faintly beneath the weight of stone. Those molecules reveal a biosphere more layered than once imagined, a world where microscopic organisms shared the oceans with larger but still delicate forms of life. Bodies made not from mineral but from flexible tissues that could not easily survive burial. Bodies that lived fully and then dissolved. And such organisms may have shaped the chemical environment of the oceans in ways that the rocks still record. Large communities of multicellular life resting upon the seafloor could influence how organic carbon moved through ecosystems. They might slow the decay of microbial mats. They might alter nutrient cycles by grazing or filtering the surrounding water. Over immense spans of time, those small changes could ripple outward into global chemistry. The isotopic record may hold faint echoes of such ecosystems, yet the shapes themselves remain hidden. Chemistry speaks only of influence, not identity. This quiet limitation leaves room for wonder, not the loud wonder of impossible stories or sudden revelations, but the gentle curiosity that grows when the planet offers hints without full explanations. What forms might have lived in those ancient seas? Perhaps simple multicellular organisms spread across shallow shelves, absorbing nutrients from microbial landscapes below them. Perhaps drifting colonies gathered together in patterns shaped by currents and sunlight. Perhaps early forms of mobility appeared. Organisms slowly gliding across sediments, leaving disturbances too subtle to survive the long transformation into stone. Such possibilities remain invisible to the fossil record. But the chemistry of the rocks suggests that life was already interacting with the environment in ways far beyond simple microbial breathing. The oceans were changing, the biosphere was evolving, and somewhere within that slow unfolding, the foundations of complex ecosystems were quietly assembling themselves. Energy flowed differently through organisms that could coordinate the actions of many cells. New relationships emerged: competition, cooperation, early food webs linking different forms of life into delicate networks, all of it occurring within bodies that were still too soft for fossilization. Bodies that the sea reclaimed quickly when their brief lives ended. The atoms carried the memory forward, carbon settling into sediments, sulfur shifting through mineral structures, molecular fragments resting silently within stone. And millions of years later, those atoms whisper. The oceans were alive in ways the fossils do not fully show. Something stirred beneath the quiet surface of the Proterozoic world, something preparing the conditions that would eventually allow skeletons to appear, turning life itself into something the rocks could finally remember clearly. But before that transformation arrived, the chemistry of the planet carried the story alone. A slow archive written in elements rather than bones. An archive that hints gently and persistently that the oceans before the Cambrian may have held far more life, far more complexity than the silence of stone first suggests. And beyond chemistry lies another mystery still. Because if complex bodies existed before skeletons hardened the memory of life, then awareness itself may have flickered briefly within forms that left no trace behind. Some kinds of intelligence are soft, too soft for stone, and the oceans are very good at keeping such secrets. Intelligence. Before bones. Intelligence is a quiet thing, and it does not always roar through the world with tools and fire and towering cities. Often it begins as something softer, an awareness of light, a sensitivity to movement in water, a faint recognition that the world beyond the body contains patterns worth responding to. In the earliest oceans, long before skeletons etched their shapes into stone, life had already spent billions of years learning how to interact with its environment. Cells sensed chemical gradients. They drifted toward warmth. They moved away from danger. Even the simplest organisms carried within them a form of awareness, an ability to detect change and adjust their behavior in response. These abilities were not thoughts, not decisions in the way modern minds understand them, but they were beginnings, tiny fragments of something that, and across immense stretches of time, could grow into coordination, memory, and eventually what might be called intelligence. The ancient seas before the Cambrian were filled with organisms capable of sensing their surroundings. Microbes could detect sunlight and swim toward it. Others sensed nutrients dissolving through the water and followed those invisible trails across the currents. Even bacterial colonies sometimes behaved collectively, coordinating their movements through chemical signals shared across thousands of individual cells. Life was already communicating, already responding, already shaping its behavior through information gathered from the environment. These early forms of awareness rarely fossilize. They exist only within living tissue. When the tissue dissolves, the behavior vanishes with it. And so the rocks cannot tell us when awareness first appeared within the biosphere. They reveal bodies, not perception, yet the biological machinery required for awareness began assembling long before skeletons appeared. Within complex cells, networks of proteins carried signals across membranes. Chemical pathways allowed cells to respond to stimuli, light, nutrients, toxins, changes in temperature. When many cells joined together to form multicellular organisms, those signaling systems expanded. Communication between cells became necessary. One group of cells might gather energy, another might handle movement, another might respond to environmental signals. To coordinate these tasks, organisms needed ways for information to travel through their bodies. The earliest forms of such communication may have been slow chemical gradients moving through tissues, but even those simple signals represented a kind of biological conversation. Cells telling other cells what they sensed. Bodies responding as unified systems rather than scattered individuals. In the oceans before the Cambrian, these conversations may have unfolded quietly within organisms that left almost no fossils behind. Soft bodies drifting through shallow seas. Colonies of cells cooperating in ways that allowed them to move slowly across sediments or position themselves within favourable currents. Such organisms may have possessed the faint beginnings of sensory structures, clusters of cells more sensitive to light or chemicals than the rest of the body, not eyes, not brains, but small concentrations of perception. The ability to detect where sunlight filtered through the water, or where nutrients gathered along the seafloor, or perhaps where other organisms rested nearby. With perception comes response. An organism able to detect change in its environment gains a small advantage. It can move toward resources, avoid harmful conditions, adjust its growth in ways that improve survival. Over millions of years, these advantages accumulate. Evolution shapes the signaling networks within bodies, making them faster, more coordinated, more capable of processing the information flowing through the environment. Eventually, in later ages, such networks would give rise to nervous systems, but the earliest steps toward those systems likely occurred long before bones appeared. Within organisms so soft that the rocks never recorded their presence, an awareness in its earliest forms may have flickered quietly through the Proterozoic oceans, bodies responding to gradients of light and chemistry, cells sharing signals across living tissues, communities of organisms interacting within ecosystems that existed entirely beyond the reach of fossilization. None of this would resemble intelligence as it is understood today. There would be no language, no memory stretching across years, no deliberate shaping of the environment. Yet within those primitive forms of perception lay the biological foundation from which later intelligence would grow. Because intelligence is not a single moment of invention, it is a long unfolding, a gradual layering of awareness, coordination, memory, and response. And the earliest layers of that unfolding may have begun in oceans far older than the first animals preserved in stone. If such awareness existed within soft-bodied organisms before the Cambrian, the evidence may never fully appear. The tissues that carried those signals dissolved long ago. The bodies that hosted those early sensory networks returned to the chemistry of the sea. Only their influence, subtle shifts in ecosystems, faint chemical signatures within the sediment, may remain. The oceans keep those stories quietly, like tides smoothing footprints from sand, and so the possibility lingers within the deep silence of Precambrian time. That awareness itself may have begun whispering through living bodies long before skeletons allowed the rocks to remember. Soft intelligence, fleeting, fragile. Drifting through ancient seas that carried its traces away before stone could listen. Awareness rarely arrives all at once. It gathers slowly, like morning light spreading across a quiet sea. In the earliest oceans, life had already learned to sense its surroundings in subtle ways. Chemical signals drifted through the water like invisible threads connecting organisms to the world beyond their bodies. Cells responded to those signals instinctively, adjusting their movement, their growth, their direction. At first, these responses were simple. A single cell sensing sunlight and drifting toward it. A cluster of cells detecting nutrients dissolving nearby and extending itself gently in that direction. Yet even within these modest reactions lay the beginning of something profound, information. So the environment speaking through gradients of light, heat, and chemistry, the organism answering. In the deep time before skeletons existed, this conversation between life and environment may have grown gradually more intricate. Multicellular organisms require coordination. When many cells gather into one body, they must share information continuously. One region senses change, another responds. Signals pass between them in waves of chemical activity. In modern animals, these signals travel through nerves. But nerves themselves evolved from simpler communication systems that existed long before animals appeared in the fossil record. Even among living organisms today, many forms of coordination occur without true nervous systems. Jellyfish drift through oceans guided by diffuse networks of nerve cells. The plants respond to light and gravity through chemical signaling alone. Awareness can exist in many forms. It does not require a brain, and so the oceans of the Proterozoic world may have contained organisms capable of sensing their surroundings in ways far more complex than the fossil record reveals. Soft-bodied creatures resting upon microbial mats, filamentous organisms drifting through shallow waters, colonies of cells cooperating with inflexible bodies that responded slowly to changes in the environment around them, light shifting across the surface of the sea, nutrients carried by gentle currents, temperature gradients rising from volcanic warmth beneath the ocean floor. All of these signals moved through ancient waters, and living bodies, however simple, could respond. The earliest sensory structures may have been nothing more than clusters of cells particularly sensitive to certain stimuli. One patch of tissue detecting light, another sensing chemicals dissolved within the surrounding water. These clusters might guide the growth of the organism, directing it toward favourable conditions where energy could be gathered more easily. In such ways, bodies begin to orient themselves within their environment. Orientation becomes movement. Movement becomes behaviour. Behaviour, repeated across generations and shaped by natural selection, slowly becomes something more organised. Not yet thought, but direction, preference. A faint pattern of response emerging from the quiet chemistry of living tissue. Such patterns would leave no trace in stone. They would exist only in the living moment of the organism. And when that organism dissolved back into the sea, the pattern would vanish with it. Yet evolution does not forget. Each generation carries forward small changes that improve survival for those that came before. If organisms capable of sensing and responding to their environment had advantages within those ancient ecosystems, their descendants would carry those abilities forward, gradually refining them, expanding them, building new layers of coordination within living bodies. Over immense spans of time, such refinements could eventually produce nervous systems capable of transmitting signals quickly across entire organisms. The earliest animals preserved in the Cambrian fossil record already possess such systems. Their bodies reveal muscles, sensory organs, coordinated movement. But the evolutionary roots of those systems must lie deeper in time, long before skeletons appeared, long before stone learned how to remember animals clearly. Within the soft-bodied biosphere of the Proterozoic oceans, the foundations of perception may have been quietly assembling. Cells learning to communicate, bodies learning to orient themselves toward light or nutrients, organisms responding to the presence of other living forms around them. These responses may have been slow, gentle, but they represented the first steps toward the biological complexity that would later produce brains and conscious awareness. In those early ages, intelligence, if it can be called that, would have been diffuse, spread across tissues rather than concentrated within a central organ, and a body sensing its environment not through a single mind, but through countless small reactions occurring throughout its living structure. The ocean carried those bodies patiently, currents shifting them from place to place, sediment settling softly beneath them, and when their brief lives ended, the sea reclaimed them as it had reclaimed countless organisms before. Soft intelligence leaves no fossils, it leaves only influence. Perhaps subtle changes in ecosystems, perhaps the faint chemical traces of organisms interacting with their environment in ways that shape the flow of energy through ancient seas. But the awareness itself, the moment of sensing light, the response to a drifting current, disappears completely. The rocks remain silent about such moments. Yet the possibility remains that life had already begun exploring the pathways of perception long before the Cambrian animals etched clearer evidence into the fossil record. Awareness unfolding slowly through fragile bodies, evolution experimenting with new ways of sensing and responding to the world, all of it occurring within oceans that practiced forgetting. Because water does not keep the memory of thought, it keeps only motion, and the earliest flickers of intelligence may have moved through those ancient seas as softly as drifting plankton, present for a moment, then gone before stone could learn their names. Intelligence in its earliest form may not resemble a mind at all. It may resemble listening. The quiet act of sensing the world and allowing that sensing to guide movement through it. But in the ancient oceans, before bones hardened bodies into memory, life had already spent immense ages learning how to listen to its surroundings. Every cell carried within it delicate instruments of perception, proteins that responded to light, receptors that detected chemical traces drifting through water, structures capable of feeling warmth or pressure. These instruments did not think, they reacted. Yet reaction is the seed from which awareness grows. Imagine an organism resting upon the soft sediment of an ancient seabed nearly 700 million years ago. Its body spreads gently across the microbial mat beneath it, absorbing nutrients that rise slowly from the living film below. Above, sunlight filters through the shallow water in pale shifting patterns. The organism has no eyes. But certain cells along its surface respond more strongly to light than others. Where light grows brighter, energy flows more easily. Where light fades, growth slows. Over time, the body expands in the direction of greater illumination, slowly orienting itself toward the surface. Not a decision, not intention, but response. A conversation between environment and organism carried through chemistry. Now imagine another organism drifting nearby, brushing softly against the first. The contact disturbs the cells along its edge. Signals pass inward through the tissue. Small, chemical waves traveling slowly from cell to cell. The organism shifts, perhaps withdrawing slightly, perhaps expanding in a different direction. Again, not thought, but reaction. And yet these reactions form patterns. They're patterns that shape how the organism interacts with the world around it. Over countless generations, natural selection favors patterns that lead to survival. Bodies that sense their environment more effectively gather more energy. Bodies that respond to danger more quickly endure longer. Bodies capable of coordinating their internal responses grow larger and more complex. Step by step, evolution builds new layers upon the old. Cells communicating with neighboring cells. Clusters of sensitive tissue forming primitive sensory structures. Gradually, the architecture of perception grows more elaborate. In later ages, these structures will become eyes, antennae, and nervous systems capable of transmitting signals rapidly across entire bodies. But their earliest ancestors likely appeared long before skeletons fossilized those bodies in stone. The Proterozoic oceans may have carried organisms capable of sensing their environment in subtle but meaningful ways. Organisms that adjusted their growth toward light. Organisms that detected chemical trails left by nearby life. Organisms that responded to currents, pressure, and temperature through networks of chemical communication flowing across their tissues. These abilities would have shaped behavior. Slow, gentle behavior. But behavior nonetheless. Movement across the seafloor in search of better conditions. Avoidance of regions where toxins gathered. Subtle positioning within currents that carried nutrients more reliably. Over time, that such behaviors could begin to resemble something like strategy, an organism occupying favorable environments more often than others. Yet none of this leaves a fossil. Behavior dissolves when the body dissolves. The sediment records the outline of a shell. It does not record the choices made by the creature that once inhabited it. In the pre-Cambrian oceans, where shells had not yet appeared, even the bodies themselves rarely survived burial. And so the earliest chapters of biological awareness remain hidden. Perhaps the oceans carried countless small experiments in perception long before animals with recognizable nervous systems appeared. Bodies learning to coordinate signals across tissues. Cells specializing in sensing the outside world. Colonies of organisms interacting with one another across shallow ecosystems that stretched along the edges of ancient continents. Such communities might have developed forms of ecological awareness, organisms responding not just to the environment itself but to the presence of other life. Competition for space, competition for nutrients, subtle signals guiding growth or movement in response to neighbors nearby. These interactions could shape ecosystems in ways that chemistry alone might faintly reveal. Carbon cycles shifting, oxygen levels fluctuating, energy flowing through communities that the fossil record never captured. The oceans of that distant age were patient witnesses. They carried those bodies across generations too numerous to imagine. They dissolved those bodies when their time ended. And the rocks, forming slowly beneath layers of sediment, preserved only faint traces of what had occurred above. Yet the possibility remains that the roots of intelligence, the earliest stirrings of perception and response, had already begun unfolding within those ancient waters. Not minds as the modern world knows them, but beginnings, soft beginnings, delicate architectures of awareness carried by organisms whose bodies were too fragile for the long patience of stone. When the Cambrian animals later appeared, with eyes and nerves and skeletons strong enough to fossilize, they did not emerge from emptiness. They emerged from billions of years of biological experimentation hidden beneath the silence of earlier oceans. And within that silence, the first whispers of intelligence may already have drifted quietly through living tissue. Like faint currents beneath dark water, present, moving, but never recorded, because the softest stories of life rarely survive long enough for stone to remember them, the planet that erases itself. The Earth does not keep its past the way a library keeps books. A library preserves, the planet transforms. Stone rises from the ocean floor and becomes mountains. Mountains crumble beneath wind and rain until their grains return to rivers. Rivers carry those grains back to the sea, where they settle again into quiet layers that will one day harden into new rock. The story begins again. This endless circulation of stone is one of the quiet engines of the Earth. Beneath continents and oceans, vast plates of crust drift slowly across the mantle, guided by heat rising from deep within the planet. These plates move with the patience of glaciers, centimeters each year, a motion almost invisible in the short span of human time. But across millions of years, continents wander. Seas open and close, and entire landscapes vanish. Along the edges of tectonic plates lie deep trenches, where the crust bends downward and disappears into the mantle. These are the subduction zones, long wounds in the ocean floor where stone returns to the interior of the Earth. Sediments resting upon that ocean floor descend with it. Layer after layer of ancient seabed sinks slowly downward. Within those layers may lie fossils, microbial textures, chemical traces of organisms that once lived and died in waters far above. Yet as the crust descends, heat increases. Pressure grows immense, the minerals inside the rock rearrange themselves. As sediments become metamorphic stone, stone softens, and eventually melts. Whatever fossils or chemical signatures once rested within those layers are transformed beyond recognition. The planet consumes its own history. Oceanic crust rarely survives more than 200 million years before it is drawn into this recycling process. Compared to the vast age of Earth, more than 4.5 billion years, 200 million years is only a brief moment, which means nearly every ocean floor that existed before the age of dinosaurs has already vanished. The seafloors that carried the ecosystems of the Proterozoic world have largely disappeared into the mantle. If complex life flourished across those ancient oceans, the rocks that once recorded it may no longer exist. They have been folded into the interior of the Earth. The memory melted. Only fragments escaped. Certain pieces of continental crust are far older than the surrounding ocean floors. These stable regions, known as cratons, form the ancient hearts of continents. Within them survive rocks more than 3 billion years old, rare survivors from the earliest chapters of planetary history. But even these rocks have endured enormous change, heat, pressure, metamorphism, bending their original structures into new forms. A fossil pressed into sediment billions of years ago may no longer resemble a fossil after such transformation. Its shape blurred, its minerals rearranged, its delicate structures lost within the crystalline growth of new stone. Time itself alters the archive. The deeper into the past the rocks travel, the more their original details fade. And so the earliest history of life on Earth remains, partly hidden not because life was absent, but because the planet itself refuses to preserve its oldest pages intact. The Earth writes its story in eras, but it erases the earliest chapters as it continues writing the next. Mountains grow, mountains vanish, oceans form, oceans close. The continents drift across the surface like quiet thoughts moving through the mind of a restless world. And beneath all of it, the mantle circulates slowly, carrying fragments of ancient crust downward where heat dissolves their memory. This is the great forgetting of geology, a forgetting not caused by neglect, but by motion. The planet is alive with movement. Its surface is never still long enough to preserve everything that occurs upon it. And only rare conditions allow certain rocks to escape the cycle. A fragment of crust isolated from subduction. Sediments buried gently within continental interiors where pressure reshapes them without entirely erasing their past. These fragments become windows. Through them, scientists glimpse faint traces of life that existed billions of years ago. Microbial mats preserved in ancient limestone, isotopic signatures hinting at early metabolisms. Occasionally, the ghost-like impressions of soft organisms pressed into long-vanished seafloors. But the windows are narrow. Most of the landscape beyond them is gone, which means the true complexity of the ancient biosphere may have unfolded across regions of ocean floor that the Earth has already reclaimed. Entire ecosystems may have lived and vanished upon crust that now lies deep within the mantle. The rocks that once held their fossils transformed into new minerals long ago. The bodies dissolved, the sediments melted, and the planet moved on. Earth is not a careful historian. It is a patient recycler. It allows life to flourish across its surface. But it rarely preserves every trace of that flourishing. Instead, it folds the past back into itself, returning old stone to the deep furnace where continents are reborn. And so when the fossil record grows silent, it may not mean that nothing happened. It may simply mean that the rocks that once knew the answer no longer exist. The Earth has already carried them away, downward, into darkness, where even stone forgets the shapes it once held. Yet despite this endless erasure, and a few fragments of memory remain, fragments that hint at something stirring within the oceans long before skeletons appeared, fragments that lead toward the next turning point in the history of life. Because eventually, the planet would create conditions where bodies hardened, where skeletons formed, where life itself became stubborn enough to resist the slow dissolving power of water and time. And when that moment arrived, the silence of stone would finally begin to break. Deep beneath the continents, the Earth moves with a patience older than memory. Stone that once formed the floor of ancient seas now travels slowly through darkness, drawn downward by the steady pull of tectonic motion. The descent is silent. No waves mark the passage. No light follows the sinking crust as it disappears beneath neighbouring plates. And only pressure, only heat, the slow return of surface to interior. Within those sinking layers lie sediments that once rested beneath forgotten oceans, grains of sand that drifted down through quiet water, minerals shaped by the breath of ancient life, perhaps even faint impressions of organisms that once lived upon the seafloor. But the journey downward changes everything. As the crust descends, temperatures rise steadily. Water locked inside minerals escapes in quiet bursts of steam. New crystals grow where old ones once lay. The rock transforms from sediment into something denser, more compact, more crystalline. The delicate structures of fossils, if they existed, rarely survive this transformation. Soft shapes blur, mineral traces rearrange. Eventually, the stone becomes something new altogether. That what once held the quiet memory of a living body becomes part of the mantle's slow circulation. The Earth absorbs its past. Yet this process is not destruction alone. It is renewal. The same forces that erase ancient ocean floors also create new ones. Along the long ridges that wind across the seafloor like hidden mountain chains, molten rock rises gently from the mantle. It cools as it meets the cold ocean water above, forming fresh crust that begins its long journey outward. A newborn seabed, empty at first, but never for long. Sediment soon begins to fall through the water above it. Tiny grains of dust carried by wind from distant continents. Fragments of shells and microorganisms drifting down after brief lives in the sunlit ocean. Layer by layer, the seafloor gathers its quiet archive. The cycle begins again. Across hundreds of millions of years, this constant renewal reshapes the surface of the planet. Continents break apart and drift across the globe like slow travelers' guided by invisible currents deep within the mantle. Supercontinents gather, then fracture. Oceans widen, then close. Mountains rise from collisions between drifting land masses, only to erode again beneath rain and wind until their sediments return to the sea. Every cycle reshapes the stage upon which life unfolds. Coastlines shift, shallow seas expand or disappear. Entire ecosystems must adapt to landscapes that move beneath them over spans of time so vast that no single species can witness the change. During the ages before the Cambrian world blossomed with visible animals, these geological transformations were already underway. Continents formed and dissolved, and oceans deepened and retreated. Volcanoes released gases that slowly altered the atmosphere above the planet. Each change reshaped the chemistry of the seas. Each shift created new environments where life could experiment with different forms. But the rocks that recorded those experiments were rarely allowed to rest undisturbed for long. Many were drawn back into the mantle, others were lifted into mountains where erosion slowly stripped away their layers. Even the oldest surviving rocks have often been bent and folded through immense pressures that blur their original details. It is as though the planet writes its history upon pages that are constantly being revised. Sentences erased, paragraphs rewritten, entire chapters removed. What remains for the present world to read is only a partial manuscript. It's in a scattering of preserved fragments surrounded by long silences. Within those silences lies the possibility that much of early biological history unfolded upon surfaces that no longer exist. Ancient continental shelves where soft-bodied ecosystems may have spread across warm, shallow seas. Seafloors where multicellular organisms experimented with new ways of gathering energy from sunlight or microbial life. Communities drifting through currents that no longer flow. The stone that might have preserved those worlds may already be gone, recycled into new crust, or transformed into minerals deep beneath the continents. The Earth forgets not because it wishes to hide its past, it forgets because it never stops moving. Motion is its nature, heat rises, crust shifts. The stone returns to the mantle where new landscapes will someday emerge, and yet even within this endless cycle of erasure and renewal, a few pieces of memory remain. Fragments of ancient rock that escape the downward pull of subduction. Sediments preserved in quiet corners of continents where time passed more gently. Within those fragments lie faint hints of life that existed long before the Cambrian seas erupted with skeleton-bearing animals. Hints that something was already stirring in the biosphere. Something preparing the conditions for one of the most extraordinary transformations in the history of life. Because eventually the oceans would change, oxygen would rise, predation would appear, and bodies would begin to harden into mineral structures strong enough to endure burial within sediment. For the first time, their life would leave behind shapes that stone could hold clearly. The long silence of the fossil record would begin to break. But beneath that sudden clarity lies a deeper history still. An ocean of forgotten experiments carried away by a planet that's always rewriting itself. And the memory of those experiments may remain only as whispers within the oldest surviving stones. Whispers that lead slowly toward the next turning of Earth's long story. The Cambrian Awakening. For most of Earth's long history, life moved quietly. Bodies drifted through water with the softness of mist. Ecosystems unfolded in silence beneath seas that erased their shapes almost as quickly as they appeared. For billions of years, the planet carried life gently without the sharp outlines that fossils would later preserve. Then something changed. And not suddenly in the way the storms appear on a summer horizon, but gradually, like dawn spreading through a long night. The oceans began to fill with forms that were no longer made only of softness. Shells, pens, mineral armor growing within living tissue. For the first time, life was learning how to become stone. This transformation unfolded during a span of time now known as the Cambrian period, beginning roughly 540 million years ago. In the language of geology, it arrived quickly. Across only a few tens of millions of years, a brief moment compared to the billions that came before, the fossil record blossomed with complexity. Creatures appeared whose bodies carried structures strong enough to endure burial. Skeletons hardened within tissues, shells formed along the surfaces of living bodies. The segments articulated into limbs capable of movement across the seafloor. Eyes evolved, or organs that turned light itself into information. The oceans awakened. Trilobites crept across the sediments in great numbers, their segmented bodies protected by hard exoskeletons that would later fossilize beautifully within ancient stone. Worm-like creatures burrowed through the mud, leaving tunnels that preserved the traces of their movement long after their bodies had vanished. Strange animals with armored plates swam slowly through the water, while others anchored themselves to the seafloor with mineral shells that filtered nutrients from passing currents. The seas, once quiet gardens of soft forms, became places of motion. Movement meant interaction. Interaction meant competition. Predation arrived. Bodies that once rested peacefully upon microbial mats now needed protection against organisms capable of feeding upon them. Shells thickened, armor developed, defensive spines appeared along soft tissues that had once been unguarded. The ancient ecosystems shifted. Energy moved differently through food webs, now shaped by pursuit and escape. Where once organisms gathered nutrients passively from sunlight or microbial life, many now hunted or scavenged. The oceans had discovered speed. Yet this awakening did not emerge from emptiness. The animals of the Cambrian period were not sudden inventions appearing from nothing. Their complexity was built upon foundations laid across billions of years of biological experimentation. Cells had already learned how to cooperate within multicellular bodies. That chemical signaling networks had evolved long before nerves carried information through tissues. The earliest hints of perception, the ability to sense light, chemicals, movement, had likely existed within soft organisms long before skeletons appeared. The Cambrian transformation revealed those ancient innovations all at once because skeletons made preservation possible. Stone could finally remember clearly. Before skeletons, life had remained soft. After skeletons, the archive of geology began filling with bodies. Yet even in this awakening, the shadows of earlier worlds remained. Some Cambrian animals show anatomical features whose evolutionary roots stretch deep into the Proterozoic past. Nervous systems, digestive tracts, muscle tissues, all of these require long evolutionary histories to develop. Their sudden appearance in the fossil record may simply reflect the moment when those features became visible in stone. The true origins of animal complexity may lie far deeper in time, hidden within organisms whose soft bodies never fossilized. The Cambrian period, then, may represent less a beginning and more a revelation. A moment when life crossed a threshold where its forms could finally endure the patience of sediment and pressure. The planet had spent billions of years experimenting with softness. Now it was learning hardness, minerals entering living tissue, calcium forming protective shells, silica strengthening microscopic skeletons in organisms drifting through sunlit water. Once these structures appeared, the geological record transformed. A layer upon layer of sediment captured the shapes of living bodies resting upon ancient seafloors. Fossils accumulated, the story of life became visible. Yet beneath those fossils lies the immense quiet of the earlier world. The billions of years where life evolved almost entirely in forms too fragile for preservation. The Cambrian animals stand like sudden sculptures rising from a deep ocean of forgotten time. Beautiful, complex, but built upon foundations hidden beneath layers that stone can barely remember. The awakening of the Cambrian did not erase that earlier silence. It simply illuminated the surface of a much older story. A story written in soft bodies drifting through ancient seas. A story carried by chemistry, by cellular cooperation, led by the slow evolution of perception within fragile tissues that dissolved long before skeletons preserved their existence. The rocks now hold the shapes of trilobites, worms, and early arthropods clearly. But beneath them lies a deeper ocean of time where life was already ancient, already exploring the possibilities of complexity. And somewhere within that deeper ocean may lie chapters the planet has never fully revealed. Because even when skeletons appear, the Earth continues its quiet habit of forgetting. Some fossils remain, many vanish, and the earliest experiments of life remain folded beneath layers of stone that grow harder to read with every passing age. The Cambrian awakening, for all its brilliance, may simply mark the moment when the planet finally allowed the story of life to be seen. But the story itself began long before, and its oldest pages remain hidden beneath the slow breathing of time. When the Cambrian seas began to fill with life that stone could finally remember, the planet did not celebrate. The Earth does not mark its turning points with noise. It lets them unfold quietly. Sediment falls through water. Bodies rest upon the seafloor. Time presses gently from above, and slowly, the memory of the moment becomes stone. The animals of the Cambrian world were unlike anything the earlier oceans had preserved. Their bodies carried mineral strength, structures that resisted decay long enough for burial to protect them. When they died, their shells and skeletons remained where they fell. Mud settled over them, pressure deepened, minerals filled the spaces where soft tissue had once existed. As fossils formed, the Earth had learned how to keep clearer records. Yet even in this age of awakening, the oceans still held mysteries. Many Cambrian creatures appear suddenly in the fossil record with surprising complexity already in place. Arthropods with jointed limbs and compound eyes. Worm-like animals with muscular bodies capable of burrowing through sediment. Early mollusks carrying protective shells. These organisms possessed intricate biological systems: circulation, digestion, coordinated movement. Such systems rarely emerge quickly. They grow slowly across long evolutionary pathways, which suggests that the foundations of Cambrian life were already ancient before their bodies hardened into fossil form. Their fossil record shows their arrival clearly. but it does not show the quiet ages during which those abilities first evolved. Eyes, for instance, require layers of biological innovation, cells that detect light, tissues capable of focusing that light, neural pathways able to process the information it provides. Each of these features likely began in much simpler forms long before the Cambrian animals carried recognizable eyes upon their bodies. Light-sensitive patches may have existed within soft organisms drifting through Proterozoic seas, clusters of cells responding faintly to brightness or shadow, gradually refining themselves through millions of generations, until one day the structures became complex enough to leave visible traces in fossilized anatomy. The same may be true for movement. The muscular systems that allowed Cambrian animals to swim, crawl, or burrow must have evolved through earlier stages where bodies experimented with coordination between tissues. Simple contractions, gradual shifts in body shape, slow motion across the seafloor. These behaviours would have unfolded within organisms that the rocks rarely preserved. Soft-bodied ancestors whose fossils dissolved before stone could remember them. The Cambrian world, then, may represent the moment when a hidden biological revolution finally became visible, an unveiling. Beneath the surface of earlier oceans, life had been quietly assembling the machinery required for complexity, cellular cooperation, energy-rich metabolism supported by rising oxygen levels, communication networks within tissues, primitive sensory systems capable of detecting changes in the environment. When skeletons appeared, these ancient innovations suddenly became visible in the fossil archive. Stone could finally capture them. Yet even within the Cambrian period itself, the fossil record remained selective. Some animals fossilized beautifully, others vanished without leaving more than faint impressions behind. Soft tissues still dissolved quickly after death. Entire species may have existed whose bodies were never preserved. Even today, the deep ocean contains organisms that may never fossilize despite thriving across vast ecosystems. Preservation is always partial. Stone remembers only a fraction of what once lived. But the Cambrian seas were undeniably alive with new forms. Predators moved through the water with increasing speed. Some animals developed grasping appendages capable of capturing prey, and others evolved shells thick enough to resist attack. The earliest arms race of biological evolution had begun, defense and offense shaping one another across generations, each adaptation encouraging another. Eyes improved, armor thickened, movement grew faster. Life became dynamic in ways earlier ecosystems had rarely displayed. Energy flowed differently through these communities. Food webs grew more intricate. Small organisms fed upon microbes. Larger organisms fed upon them. And the seafloor, once a relatively undisturbed landscape of microbial mats, became a place where burrowing animals churned the sediment as they searched for food. This change altered the structure of marine ecosystems profoundly. The ancient mats that once stabilized the seabed were disrupted by movement. Sediment mixed more freely. The nutrients circulated in new patterns. The oceans were no longer quiet gardens, they had become living landscapes shaped by motion and interaction. And as life moved through those landscapes, the fossils accumulated. Trilobite shells scattered across the seafloor. Worm burrows preserved as delicate tunnels through hardened mud. Fragments of early skeletons settling gently into the sedimentary record. Layer upon layer of stone captured the awakening. But beneath that awakening lies a deeper silence still. The billions of years when life existed mostly in softness. The ages when perception, coordination, and perhaps the earliest flickers of biological awareness began to emerge within fragile bodies drifting through ancient seas. The Cambrian Explosion did not invent complexity, it revealed it. And even as the fossil record grew richer, the Earth continued its quiet habit of forgetting. Ocean floors sank into the mantle, mountains eroded, sediment transformed beneath pressure. Some fossils survived, many vanished. The story of life became clearer but never complete. Because the planet does not preserve everything. It preserves only enough to remind the future that something remarkable once lived here. And beneath every fossil that remains lies an ocean of time where life moved unseen, soft, patient, waiting for the moment when stone would finally begin to remember. But the Earth still holds one final silence, a deeper reflection on what it means for a planet to forget. Because memory itself, like life, is fragile, and some truths drift forever beneath the surface. of time. The memories he saw beneath tons. What if Earth once knew something and forgot? Not through carelessness, not through loss, but through the quiet turning of time itself. Beneath every mountain and desert, beneath forests and cities and sleeping oceans, the planet carries layers of stone that once rested beneath older skies. Those layers hold fragments of memory, fossils, minerals, subtle chemical signatures pressed gently into the rock, but the deeper those layers sink into the past, the more fragile the memory becomes. Whole landscapes vanish. Seafloors descend into the mantle. Mountains crumble into rivers and drift back to the sea. The Earth is not built to preserve everything. It is built to move, and movement erases. The story of life, when viewed across billions of years, becomes less like a clear record and more like a half-remembered dream. Some moments appear vividly in the fossil record, creatures with shells and bones resting beautifully preserved within sedimentary stone. Other moments fade, the bodies dissolve, the rocks that once held their traces disappear entirely, and between those fragments stretches an immense quiet. The time before the Cambrian awakening lies inside that quiet. For nearly 4 billion years, life lived upon this planet before skeletons became common enough for the rocks to remember clearly. During those ages, organisms drifted through ancient seas in bodies made almost entirely of softness. Membranes, proteins, delicate tissues shaped by water rather than stone. They lived. They sensed their surroundings. Some may have moved slowly across microbial landscapes. Some may have responded to light or chemical signals drifting through the currents. Some may even have explored the earliest beginnings of awareness, cells communicating across tissues in ways that foreshadowed the nervous systems of later animals. But when their brief lives ended, the sea reclaimed them. Softness dissolves quickly, the sediment settles quietly above the place where the body once rested, and the fossil record remains empty. Yet emptiness in stone does not always mean emptiness in life. The oceans of that distant world may have carried ecosystems far richer than the rocks can show. Complex cells had already evolved. Multicellular organisms were beginning to explore new possibilities of cooperation and form. And chemical traces buried within ancient rock hinted a biosphere stirring with activity long before the Cambrian seas erupted with skeleton-bearing animals. The atoms remember motion, even when bodies vanish. Carbon cycles shifting across continents, sulfur signatures changing within ancient sediments. Molecules once part of living cells preserved faintly within stone older than the first animals. These traces suggest a world where life was already interacting with the planet in profound ways, a biosphere breathing slowly across oceans that left few fossils behind. Perhaps the Cambrian explosion was not the beginning of complexity. Perhaps it was only the moment when complexity became visible, the moment when life hardened its bodies enough for stone to keep the memory. Everything before that moment remains partly hidden. And 1 billion years of biological experimentation unfolding in forms too delicate for preservation. Soft ecosystem rising and fading along coastlines that no longer exist. Ancient organisms sensing light, responding to currents, interacting within communities that left almost no trace. The Earth may have carried many such worlds layered across time like sediments settling quietly upon the seafloor. Some lasted millions of years and vanished more quickly, but most dissolved before the rocks could learn their shapes, and the planet moved on, because the Earth does not cling to its past. It folds the past inward. Old stone melts, new stone rises, continents wander slowly across the globe, reshaping oceans and climates that guide the evolution of life. The story continues. But the earliest chapters grow fainter with every passing age. What remains are whispers, fragments of chemistry, ghost-like impressions in rare sediments, fossils that appear suddenly in the Cambrian record as though life itself had awakened overnight. Yet the long silence before that awakening reminds us of something deeper. Memory is selective. Even a planet forgets. Not everything that lives will be recorded. Not every experiment of evolution will survive burial. Some stories dissolve into the ocean, some sink into the mantle, some fade into chemistry that only faintly hints at their existence. And perhaps that is fitting. Because life itself is not built to last forever. It moves, it adapts, it rises and falls with the shifting surface of a restless world. The Earth carries these cycles quietly, at breathing continents upward from the mantle, drawing oceans downward again, allowing new forms of life to emerge while older forms drift into silence. And beneath all of it lies the deepest archive of all, Time itself, a vast unfolding where even memory erodes slowly, where the earliest worlds slip beyond the reach of stone, where the oceans keep secrets older than bones. What if Earth once knew something, and forgot? Not lost, not destroyed, simply buried beneath layers of substance where only atoms still remember the breath of ancient seas. And somewhere within that cloudness the planet continues turning, slowly, patiently, waiting for the next story to settle into stone. What if Earth once knew something, and forgot? The question does not echo loudly across the cliffs of time. It settles more gently than that. Unlike fine sediment drifting through deep water, it lowers itself into the quiet spaces between what the rocks remember and what they no longer hold. The planet has always been a keeper of fragments, not full stories. Fragments, a trilobite shell resting in Cambrian stone, the faint ripple of a worm burrow pressed into ancient mud, the ghostly outline of an Ediacaran organism flattened beneath layers of sediment long hardened into rock. Each fossil feels like a voice reaching across hundreds of millions of years, yet even these voices are incomplete. They speak of bodies, not lives, of shapes, not thoughts, and beneath them lies an older silence that stretches across nearly the entire history of life itself. For most of Earth's past, organisms left no bones behind. They moved through oceans that erased their forms as easily as wind erases patterns in sand. Their tissues dissolved quickly. Their ecosystems shifted with currents and tides that carried the chemistry of life across the planet's surface. When those bodies died, the sea returned them to the endless cycles of carbon and nitrogen and sulfur. Atoms scattered, energy passed onward into other living forms. Nothing remained long enough for stone to remember. And yet life was there. The chemistry of ancient rock tells us so. The subtle imbalances of isotopes whisper of metabolism older than forests, older than animals, older even than the oxygen-rich sky under which the modern world breathes. The biosphere has always been active, always experimenting, always reshaping the surface of the planet in quiet ways. Across billions of years, those experiments unfolded in bodies that were mostly soft, flexible tissues responding to sunlight, nutrients, temperature, and the presence of other living things drifting nearby. In those fragile bodies, cells learned to cooperate. Signals moved through living tissues. Organisms sensed their surroundings and responded. Slowly, gently, perhaps the earliest forms of awareness flickered there. Not thought as the modern mind understands it, but response, orientation, a body leaning toward light, another withdrawing from harm, information flowing through living matter. These moments left no fossil. They existed only while the body lived, and when the body dissolved, the moment vanished with it. Yet evolution carried the lessons forward, generation after generation. Small refinements accumulating within the architecture of life, cells becoming more specialized, communication between tissues growing more intricate, perception sharpening across ages that stone struggles to preserve. By the time skeletons appeared in the Cambrian seas, the machinery of complexity was already ancient. Eyes could form because light-sensitive cells had existed long before. Muscles could move because coordination between cells had evolved slowly across earlier worlds. Nervous systems could emerge because bodies had already spent millions of years learning how to pass information across living tissues. The Cambrian Explosion revealed these abilities, but it did not invent them. They were the visible flowering of roots that extended deep into the silent ages of the Proterozoic oceans, as roots that the rocks remember only faintly because the Earth, for all its age and patience, is not a perfect archivist. It forgets. Stone melts, sediment erodes, ocean floors sink quietly into the mantle where heat dissolves their ancient layers. The pages of planetary history are constantly rewritten, and yet a few fragments remain, enough to remind the future that life was already old before the Cambrian animals carved their skeletons into memory, enough to reveal that the biosphere had been breathing, evolving, experimenting across unimaginable spans of time, enough to leave a lingering question within the quiet halls of geology. What else once lived here? What bodies drifted through ancient seas before stone learned how to remember them? What forms of cooperation or perception unfolded within fragile organisms that left no fossils behind? Perhaps the answers will never be fully known, not because the evidence never existed, but because the Earth has already carried much of it away, downward, into the mantle, outward into eroded dust, back into the endless cycles of chemistry that sustain the living world today. But absence is not emptiness. The silence of the early fossil record may be less a void and more a veil. Behind it lies the long prelude of life, 1 billion years of experimentation unfolding beneath oceans that practiced forgetting. 1 billion years where the foundations of complexity slowly assembled themselves in bodies made of softness and water, bodies that lived completely in their moment, bodies that sensed the world, responded to it, and then returned quietly to the sea. The Earth carries those lost ages without regret, because forgetting is part of its rhythm. Mountains rise, mountains fall, oceans open, oceans close, life appears, transforms, and fades again as new forms take its place, and through it all the planet continues turning beneath the quiet stars, patient, restless, writing its story not in permanence but in layers that settle, shift, and sometimes disappear. Some truths remain visible in stone, others drift deeper into time where only atoms remember their passing. And somewhere within that vast silence, beneath fossils and continents and ancient oceans long vanished, the earliest chapters of life still rest, unfinished, unspoken, waiting in the quiet places where the Earth once knew something and slowly forgot.